The recording. There we go.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the last conference of our current season. Please be aware that today's conference is being recorded and take whatever measures you want to ensure your privacy. The recording will be available to all paid registrants. So this is the last conference that we will be having in this wonderful room at Notre Dame University on Charles Street. I want to thank everyone, Deja Mora, who's not here, and Sarah, who is, and the wonderful catering staff. Everybody has been just wonderful. We've loved being in this room that has all the latest technology and this owl. So, and thanks today also to Dr. Strutt, who is host. We are still not sure about next season. Our wonderful member, Louis Rothschild, has assembled a very notable group of speakers for next season, but we still don't have the staff to put on these conferences. So let's proceed with today's conference. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Martha Stark. Many of you remember Dr. Stark from a year or so ago when she gave a wonderful program. If you read today's description of the program, her first paragraph is perfection itself. So Martha Stark, MD, a graduate of Harvard Medical School and the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute, is a holistic adult and child psychiatrist and integrative psychoanalyst in private practice in Boston, Massachusetts, and Clearwater Beach, Florida. She is faculty at Harvard Medical School and co-founder, co-director of the Center for Psychoanalytic Studies at William James College. Martha is the author of 9 highly acclaimed books, including the award-winning Modes of Therapeutic Action, Knowledge, Experience, and Relationship, which was chosen by Jason Aronson as his book of the year when it was first published, on the integration of psychodynamic theory with clinical practice. Several of her books are now required reading in the psychoanalytic training institutes and psychodynamic psychotherapy programs in the US and abroad. Dr. Stark is originator and developer of the psychodynamic synergy paradigm, a C.A.R.E.S approach to deep embodied healing. She is board certified by the American Association of Integrative Medicine. Dr. Stark also contributes chapters to integrative medicine textbooks and articles to peer-reviewed toxicology and environmental medicine journal. I'm an organic gardener, and that touches my heart. Additionally, she serves on the editorial advisory boards of various holistic health publications and sits on the advisory board of the Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute. So let's welcome Dr. Martha Stark.
Well, thank you all for being here, either in person or on Zoom. And if everybody could be muted, please, that would be great. I still see. Thanks. I appreciate that. Everybody muted. Thank you. All right. So here we go. Most of you now should have PDFs of the slides from which I will be working. And this is sort of a grand overview of my psychodynamic synergy paradigm, with so many new thoughts coming my way that I even made changes yesterday and wanted to make another one this morning. I am so busy evolving in terms of my thinking. But anyway, so here we go. It's a C.A.R.E.S, cognitive, affective, relational, existential, synaptic approach to deep embodied healing. And special thanks to Cami Woodall and Bill Kerwan. This is for Cami, a beautiful red tulip in a field of yellow tulips. All right, it is never too late. I want to make sure people can see this. Wait a minute, let me make sure. Okay. It's never too late to be what you might have been, George Eliot. The only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And this theme of our own agency, you'll find this throughout my presentation. So my psychodynamic synergy paradigm, real quick, like the first few slides are just, for some of you, it's sort of, yeah, we've seen that. And for others of you, huh? So I'm aware, I have the list of people who signed up, and half the names are familiar to me and half are not. So these first few slides are kind of an overview. There's a lot of material here. Buckle your seatbelt, bear with me. Hopefully a lot of stuff will become clearer as we advance. So model 1, classical psychoanalytic. It's more cognitive, enhancement of knowledge within. Model 2, self-psychological. The emphasis is more on affect, provision of experience for. Model 3, contemporary relational. The focus is on relational. Engagement in relationship with. Model 4, existential humanistic. Existential, fostering of surrender to, in the words of Ofra Eshel, analytic oneness, or Michael Balland, a new beginning. In essence, model 4 is about facilitating regression to redo, a therapeutic regression to redo. Model 5, quantum neuroscientific, my most recently added addition to my psychodynamic synergy paradigm. It's more synaptic, or sometimes I say somatic, envisioning of possibilities beyond. And the point is that these 5 models are all interdependent. And and over the course of a treatment, over the course of an hour, one will fluctuate, flow back and forth between these different models. It'll become clearer over time here. So basically, what my overview suggests is that we are talking about, when we're talking about, so first order change is a little more superficial. You provide support to facilitate behavioral change. My psychodynamic synergy paradigm, you will see, is a story about challenge and support in order to bring about second order change, i.e. deeper, more embodied psychodynamic change, structural change. So now we have then, with second order change, incremental replacement of what I call old bad with new good, by introducing into the equation some kind of growth incentivizing corrective challenge, whether it's done directly or indirectly, explicitly or implicitly, verbally or non-verbally, repeatedly or only a few times. So again, real quick, like model 1, which privileges cognition, it's new corrective information that's introduced into the equation to create a mismatch between old bad and new good. In model 2, it's a new corrective experience. Model 3, new corrective relationship. And of course, there's some, again, mingling and interpenetration of these 5 different approaches. Model 4, new corrective beginning, a new beginning, Michael Balland. And model 5, new corrective possibilities. Obviously, hearkening back to Alexander and French's, way back in the 1940s, groundbreaking at the time, corrective emotional experience. Although it's sort of more controversial, 1, because it was so new, and 2, the way they presented it, it seemed a little bit too mechanistic and artificial. But they were doing something that was really quite ahead of their time, impressively. So as I will later be demonstrating, strategic and artful, it's a science and an art, the work we do as psychodynamic psychotherapists. Strategic introduction into the equation of corrective challenge in the form of growth incentivizing optimal stress is at the heart of the working through process in psychodynamic psychotherapy, is my claim. Against the backdrop of empathic attunement and a collaborative alliance, we are talking about ongoing and judicious use of optimally stressful, i.e. just the right balance between challenge and support, therapeutic interventions that will offer enough anxiety-provoking challenge that there will be impetus for destabilization of the dysfunctional status quo of the defenses, but enough anxiety-assuaging support that there will be opportunity for restabilization at a higher level of adaptability and functionality. As a Model 1 example of challenge, this is a conflict statement. This introduces new corrective information to challenge the old way. So challenge followed by support in this case. You know that. So not what we know, but you know that. And in the first part of a conflict statement, we want to be highlighting not what we know and would want them to know, but actually what, quite frankly, they, albeit a bit reluctantly, they really do know on some level. So we're introducing an optimally stressful, growth incentivizing challenge to the old way. You know that I don't answer those kinds of questions. Do they know that? Yes. They know that because you've been working with them for a long time now. They keep asking the questions. They have relentless hope. We'll get into that later. And we don't answer them. So they do know, you do know that I don't answer those kinds of questions. And that ultimately, if you're ever to get better, you will need to find your own answers. They don't like thinking about that, but they do sort of know that. They get that. But now we resonate with their defense, the thing that the counterforce that gets in the way of their comfortably acknowledging the first part. But you find yourself continuing to wish that I would simply tell you what to do. So that's an instance of new corrective information in an effort to create impetus, and then by resonating with their defensive need to protest, opportunity, when we resonate empathically with where they're at, for them to evolve to a slightly higher level. We do this repeatedly, not just the one sentence, although every now and then we get lucky. And every now and then, like once every 5 years, I'll do a sentence, and quite frankly, it's transformative. But usually you have to do it repeatedly, over and over again. All right. Okay, so a clinical vignette here about Alicia, entitled Grieving the Return of Hope and a Life Reclaimed. It demonstrates beautifully the profound impact of offering the patient a new corrective experience. This would be Model 2. In this case, of being listened to, the patient, Alicia, being listened to in a way that she had never before experienced, and being taken seriously. When she was saying that she knew her reckless, daredevil behavior had been responsible for the death of a little boy, a sweet little boy who had been her dear friend, someone with whom every summer she would play for hours on end at her family's cottage on the lake. Okay, so I present now one of the most heartrending consultations I've ever done. It's a story about Alicia. So I'm gathering, I don't know what you can see now, but I'm reading now this vignette. So maybe I should stop SlideShare. I'm going to stop. Okay, and now let me see, let me see my thing here. Okay, and maybe I guess my picture will be shown. I don't know, I guess. Okay, so I present now one of the most heartrending consultations I've ever done. It's a story about Alicia, who came to see me many years ago because she was haunted by a tragic event that had occurred half a century earlier. Alicia presented as a strikingly attractive, elegantly refined, and immaculately dressed 58-year-old woman who held herself with grace and dignity. By dint of her razor-sharp intelligence and extraordinary hard work, she had established herself in a highly successful career, but had no life partner, no family, and suffered from multiple health problems, most notably malignant hypertension. She also reported having felt low-level depression and a quiet despair for most of her life. At the age of 7, Alicia had been involved in a horrific accident. She had been vacationing with her family at their summer cottage and was out slalom water skiing on the lake. In the water ahead and to the right, she had seen something breaking the surface. Was it a rock, the end of a log, a clump of seaweed? She couldn't quite make out what it was. Next thing she knew, she had run over it. Tragically, it had been a little boy out swimming, whom she had decapitated with her ski, instantaneously killing him. Alicia had then spent every single day of the next 5 decades brutally punishing herself, racked with guilt, haunted by her shame, her blood pressure inching up year after year. She couldn't live with the knowing that she had done what she had. Every one of the many therapists with whom she had consulted over the course of those years had done their best to reassure her, telling her that she had not been at fault. How could she have known? My God, she'd been only 7 at the time, a mere child. It was an accident. She had not tried to kill the little boy. She had to forgive herself. But in her heart of hearts,
Like,
Alicia...
was he just swimming? He must have been.
I'm sorry, can everybody be... Oh, I'm sorry, are you... Oh, somebody's speaking. What is it? Oh,
Infectious trying to get
okay.
in.
I guess I'll continue. Yes, he was in swimming. Okay, let's see. But in her heart of hearts, Alicia knew that although she had been only 7 at the time, she was an experienced water skier. And had she chosen to do so, she could easily enough have steered clear of and thereby avoided that mysterious object in the water. And so Alicia had spent a lifetime wrestling with her shameful secret, her inner demons, and her intense self-loathing. The knowing that she had been responsible for the death of that little boy, who, as it happened, lived only several doors down from her family's summer cottage and had been her best friend. As I listened, my heart was breaking. For this devastated, broken, guilt-ridden, tormented soul who lived every single day of her life with unspeakable grief and unbearable pain. I said very little as her story unfolded, but with hand on my heart and tears in my eyes, I nodded my understanding. The horror of it, her decades of guilt, shame, private grief, profound hopelessness, and relentless self-punishment. When I finally spoke, I said softly that I got it, why she felt responsible for his death. I told her I understood why she was having such trouble forgiving herself, such trouble figuring out a way to live with herself, what with her knowing that she could have chosen to do something different, but that she had not. I went on to say that it broke my heart to think that she had had to carry inside of her all these years her crippling guilt, her secret shame, and her unrelenting grief. And then Alicia began to reveal more and more of the horrific and incriminating details about what had actually happened that fateful summer day on the lake. That as she had approached the object in the water ahead of her and to the right, she had found herself wanting to know what exactly it was. She, always one for a challenge, had decided to test her skills as a slalom water skier by seeing how close she could get to the object without actually running it over. And so, even when she had gotten close enough to see that the thing in the water ahead of her was moving and possibly alive, and even with her knowing that she could and should veer away from it, she, as if driven by some uncontrollable inner compulsion, had made the split-second decision to jump the wake behind the boat so that she could get even closer to it, instead of staying inside the wake and carefully steering clear of that unknown object bobbing in the water ahead. While Alicia, with unflinching honesty and raw vulnerability, was recounting these more specific and revealing details, I sat very still, barely moving, barely breathing, just quietly taking it in and occasionally nodding. I knew that it was for me to be able simply to listen, to be present, to be there to help her bear the pain of it, the horror of it, the guilt of it, the shame of it, and not to withdraw, not to recoil in horror. It was for me simply to listen with compassion and without judgment, with understanding and without resistance, and certainly without attempting to reassure her that it was not her fault. Alicia alternately wept, raged, wailed, howled, fell silent. Decades of pent-up anguish, heartbreak, guilt, shame, fear, anger, torment, despair, loneliness, isolation, regret, and high blood pressure. My heart was breaking for that spirited little girl Alicia had once been, and the solemnly dignified but privately broken woman who now sat before me, surrendering at last her long-held secret guilt and searing shame. Alicia explained that she had robotically recounted her story to many therapists and others over the course of the years, but that it had always been an abridged version. She said she had held back for fear that people would not be able to bear the horror of it, that they would offer her pat reassurances that would make her feel even more misunderstood, disconnected, isolated, alone, and alienated. As she wept, sobbed, and wailed, she and I both knew that she was releasing, at long last, the reservoir of tears, pain, heartbreak, and anguish that had been accumulating inside of her for decades. She had so needed to be able to tell her truth, and she had finally found someone who was willing to listen and to bear witness. At the end of Alicia's harrowing narrative, exhausted from the effort of remembering, but visibly relaxing as she revealed the devastatingly painful details blow by blow, she said she suddenly felt a tremendous rush of relief at having shared finally what had really happened those years earlier. A wondrous release followed by an exhilarating inner calm, sense of gentle peace and serene acceptance. Alicia said she no longer felt quite as alone, because now someone else knew the real story and the incriminating details about what she had never before dared to share with anyone. Now someone else knew the truth about what had happened that summer day on the lake. And then Alicia was done. And although she came back to see me a number of additional times, at the end of the 10th session, she said she was ready to go. I told her that she would always be welcome to return were she ever to want to. She said that meant a great deal to her. At the end of our last session, as Alicia was leaving, she lingered at the door for a moment to give me a heartfelt hug, which I, of course, returned. Alicia did not ever come back, but in the interim has referred me at least 15 of her friends and colleagues, and periodically she will drop me a little note reiterating her gratitude that I was able to bear the horror of what she had done, and in that way had helped her to make her peace with if everybody could be muted, that would be appreciated, had helped her. Can maybe everybody
Martha, you're muted. If you could unmute.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for telling me that. Right. Okay. Well, let's see. So I guess I'll repeat a little bit because it's important that you hear the result. Alicia did not ever come back, but in the interim has referred me at least 15 of her friends and colleagues. And periodically, can you hear me now? I think so. Yes. Well, you'll make it. So
Yes, we can hear you now.
Thank you. And periodically, she will drop me a little note reiterating her gratitude that I was able to bear the horror of what she had done, and in that way had helped her to make her peace with the crime that she knew she had committed, albeit with no malice or ill intent those 50 years earlier. She has discovered, to her surprise and absolute delight, that she no longer struggles with depression and that she now finds herself feeling hopeful. And in one of her notes, she told me with much pride about the nonprofit organization that she had set up shortly after we met to help people who had survived the tragic loss of a loved one to deal with their heartbreak and grief. There also came a time when she informed me that her malignant hypertension was gone and that her blood pressure had returned to normal. I think of Alicia often and of how she was finally able, with incredible courage and integrity, to confront and grieve the haunting reality of her past, which allowed her not only to evolve to a place of self-forgiveness, humble acceptance, and inner peace, but also to channel all of that now freed up energy into the creation of her nonprofit. I believe that in Alicia's case, an important part of what enabled her to find absolution was the opportunity she had to confess to someone who listened with compassion and without judgment, to someone who was able to be present with her as she dared to remember, dared to confront, dared to relive, and finally dared to relent and to forgive herself. I believe that it was this that enabled her to restore her hope and reclaim her life, a new corrective experience that was transformative for her. All right, now let me just see here. I'm going to try to. Okay, am I back on? You can see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. I think that's a yes. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I don't know if you heard it from my vignette, but when Alicia had left at the very end of our 10th session, she offered me a warm, heartfelt hug, which I returned. So just wanted to name that. Okay, so here we go. All right. So superimposing an acute injury on top of a chronic one as a corrective for earlier damage. In essence, that's what we're talking about. Superimposing in the form of the treatment, in the form of our treatment of her. An acute injury, optimally stressful, growth incentivizing interventions on top of a chronic one, what she suffered with her whole lifetime, as a corrective for earlier damage. And again, it's so much easier for all of us to offer support. And again, my thought there is we can support, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. And it may enable people to make changes, first order changes in their behavior and enable them to do some things that before they weren't quite able to do. However, if we're talking about deep embodied psychodynamic change, second order change, deep structural embodied change, then we really, I believe, need, against the backdrop of empathic attunement and a collaborative alliance, we need to be offering just the right balance of challenge support. And it, sort of like, well, how do we do that? Well, we're ever busy tuning into how the patient is reacting / responding to what we're saying, what their level of anxiety is or isn't. Anxiety provoking challenge versus anxiety assuaging support. So we're ever busy, not too much, not too little, and we can backpedal or we can move forward and so on and so forth. So here we go. Acute injury on top of a chronic one as a corrective for earlier long-standing damage. So certainly in the physiological realm, superimposing an acute physical injury on top of a chronic one is sometimes exactly what the body needs to heal. And my guess is, so in fact, a chronic condition might not heal until it is made acute. And my guess is that these examples, I'll read a few, some of them you all do. High intensity interval training, intermittent fasting. I do intermittent fasting. Ischemic preconditioning, intermittent hypoxic training, hyperbaric oxygen, homeopathic remedies, vaccines and other immunotherapies, medicinal plants, dermabrasion, Fraxel laser treatments, radiofrequency microneedling, prolotherapy, PRP, PRF, vampire gum rejuvenation. Actually, I'm going to get some of that done. I'm getting a little bit long in the tooth. So my biological dentist is going to do some vampire gum rejuvenation in order to stimulate my stem cells in my gums to grow back a little bit. I'm sure that was TMI, but I felt like I wanted to share that. Stem cell facelifts, Botox, ECT, TMS, cardiac defibrillation, acupuncture, acupressure, cupping, red light therapy, infrared saunas, cold water immersion. I took a cold shower this morning. Brain teasers, mental exercises. When the body is optimally challenged, no matter how compromised it might be in its functionality, adaptive recovery will be triggered because of the body's innate resilience and intrinsic capacity to self-correct. Well, I guess I'll read the first two and then I want to skip through the next several slides. So did you know this? Depriving ourselves of half a night's sleep once a week, preferably the second half of the night, can produce a rapid, even if short-lived, restabilization of mood and recovery from depression. And the thought is that it's the stress, optimal stress, because it's one night out of 7, of interrupting normal sleep patterns that may resynchronize disturbed circadian rhythms. And with respect to intermittent fasting, a 36-hour water fast once a week, for example, from after dinner on Monday evening until breakfast on Wednesday morning, can so significantly reduce the total body burden that mental clarity and focus can be improved dramatically and a sense of overall well-being restored. And in fact, as many of you might well now know, the only type of calorie restriction diet that will not slow down our metabolism is intermittent fasting. What I now do, I used to do that 36-hour water fast about once a week. But what I now do is basically, I don't really eat breakfast until 1 or 2 in the afternoon. And then I'll eat until 9 or so, 9:30. And I go to bed pretty late. So every day, I basically have just this window of 1 or 2 p.m. to 9, that little window of eating, and the rest of the time I'm not. So we can challenge our brains with all sorts of things. For example, printing with one hand while cursive writing with the other. That's a real challenge. Or juggling. I've tried to do juggling. Nah, I can't do that. That guy's doing a great job of it. When I do juggling, I'm like busy, like throwing the ball through the window and doing all sorts of stuff. I'd like to be able to do it, but I can't. But that way you're sort of involving both sides of the brain, and it's cross-lateral training and tapping into theoretically the wisdom of both sides of the brain and facilitating the flow of information and energy between the left brain and the right brain. Here's one on your own time. You can perhaps do this. Challenge your mind by first reading all the words. That's your left brain reading. And then saying all the colors. That's your right brain. Well, I'll just do this. Okay, I'll just do this. I'll embarrass myself. And then you'll know which side of my brain I'm using more right now. Okay, blue, yellow, black, red, blue, orange, green, purple, red, black, red, orange, green, blue, black, red, purple, yellow. I read the words. That was my left brain. Now I'm going to try to say the colors. Red, blue, yellow, light green, black, red, blue, yellow, black, red, light green, dark green, yellow, dark green, blue, black, red, light green. That was my right brain. My left brain is more engaged in the moment. Cross-lateral movements. I often, before I start my work in the morning, I do with my hand an infinity sign in front of me. I'm crossing both sides of my body, and I will use my eyes follow it. Somebody taught me that way back, and I do that. Who's to say if that really works or not, but I do it even so. There you go. That's right, Bill. Back and forth, and then with your eyes follow it. And sometimes you can stand there and lift up. Oh, this one, the gal on the right here has her right leg up and her left elbow touching it. So you also have to have good balance to make sure you don't fall over. As you get older, you may have more trouble doing that. But that's a good way to just kind of get things going in there. So Bill, you can stand up and do that one too. That was a joke. All right. Indeed, optimal stress can optimize the functioning of body and brain. So too, in the psychological realm, as we shall soon see, optimal stress can jumpstart the repair of a chronic mental condition. More specifically, the strategic and ongoing generation, when you have windows of opportunity, of optimally stressful, growth incentivizing corrective challenge will give rise to internal tension and homeostatic imbalance. But states of disequilibrium within the body, from an evolutionary standpoint, cannot be tolerated for extended periods of time. Now I run, and anybody here might be interested, you could attend if you'd like, an entirely free, I call it spot supervision Zoom sessions on Thursdays from 12 noon to 1:30 Eastern time, but it's recorded for later viewing. I run this spot supervision group, and I've been doing it since the beginning of the year, and I love doing it, and I'd love any of you to join. But anyway, what we often find is the patient will be in a stuck place in the treatment, the therapist, patient stuck, and I'll ask, what kind of anxiety-provoking challenges have you offered in your time in order to create an optimally stressful situation whereby you're destabilizing the dysfunctional status quo of things, but then providing support such that they can then reconstitute or restabilize at a slightly higher level. And interestingly, often sort of like there's been a lot of support, but quite frankly, no real challenge. And so as a result, there could well have been a lot of first order change, but second order change, obviously more difficult, but that really does involve destabilizing, fall down 7 times, stand up 8. I'll get to that Japanese adage a little later because I don't think that does full justice. Fall down 7 times, stand up 8, but each time at a slightly higher level than before. But anyway, all right, so I'm getting ahead of myself. The wisdom of the body, and that's Walter Buchanan, way back in 1932, is such that it will instinctively self-correct or self-right to resolve the internal tension and restore the homeostatic balance. My psychodynamic synergy paradigm is all about a profound belief in our intrinsic, inherent, innate, inborn resilience and capacity to self-correct, self-right in the face of stressors. Each iterative healing cycle, however, will have advanced the system from less evolved to slightly more evolved and a slightly more robust level of resilience and adaptive capacity, indeed stronger at the broken places. And I know that for myself, and it's not like it's happening all the time, but in my work with my people, there will be times when I am offering something, or it'll be the cumulative impact over time, or it'll be a little more sudden and dramatic, a jolting introduction of something that's a corrective, something new. And there'll be a sort of working of that through, but ultimately a resolution. And in the aftermath of that, there really will be a sense of stronger at the broken places, more resilient, and the relationship itself between us stronger and more resilient. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Okay, good. Okay, in honor of optimal stress, is there not a certain beauty in brokenness? A beauty never achieved by things unbroken? If a bone is fractured and then heals, the area of the break will be stronger than the surrounding bone and will not again easily fracture. Are we too not stronger at our broken places? And do we too not acquire a quiet strength from surviving adversity and hardship and mastering the experience of disappointment, heartbreak, and devastation? And then when we finally rise above it, do we not rise up in quiet triumph, even if only we notice? Kintsukuroi, to repair with gold, the art of repairing pottery with gold or silver lacquer and understanding that the piece is more beautiful for having been broken. That's us. Okay, so key concepts. Now for the overview of what we're going to be doing. Working through as incrementally transforming psychological rigidity, defense, into psychological flexibility or resilience, adaptation. And I lifted that from ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, that concept, but I think it's relevant across the board for any second order deep embodied work that we do. From psychological rigidity, I'll be referring to that as defense and describing to you in a moment what I mean by defense. It's a little different, a broader based definition than the usual, into psychological resilience or adaptation. So the therapeutic creation of growth incentivizing optimal stress, just the right balance between what I'm going to be describing as disruptive attunement and homeostatic attunement. In other words, not just support, but also challenge, generated by the strategic and artful juxtaposition of, we can describe it in any of a number of ways, depending upon your lexicon, defensive, rigid need with adaptive, resilient capacity, or old bad, disempowering, and maladaptive narratives with new good, more empowering and more adaptive narratives, or the sobering and conditioned reality of what is old bad, with the enlivening and quantum possibility of what could be new good. So these optimally stressful, growth incentivizing mismatch experiences thereby created will create the internal tension and homeostatic imbalance. And again, my supervisees will often say, well, I want to be careful not to say that because the patient might then feel bad or might feel a little guilty or might feel anxious or might feel painful. Sort of like, yeah, okay. But if that's against the backdrop of a collaborative alliance and empathic attunement, you can work with that because that is the opening up of a window of opportunity for there to be deep embodied change. The working through and resolution of these mismatch experiences indeed constitutes the therapeutic action in second order psychodynamic treatments. That's a mismatch experience. All right, again, corrective challenge against the backdrop of empathic support. I said that, new information, new experience, new relationship, new beginning, new possibilities in the 5 different models to generate these iterative healing cycles, more specifically, defensive destabilization followed by adaptive restabilization at ever more nuanced levels of resilience and adaptive capacity. And we're counting on Walter Buchanan's The Wisdom of the Body as prompting resolution of the internal tension and restoration of the homeostatic balance, although each time at a new, more evolved homeostatic set point. Somehow when I was saying that, I often think about how a little girl, let's say she's 3 or 4, and the wind blows her skirt up. She has little panties on underneath, blows her skirt up, and she just knows to sort of put her skirt back down. That the body just kind of knows to sort of regulate and get it back, although again, under the right circumstances, to get it back at an even slightly more evolved, more better level. I'm going to be talking about Freud's horse and rider as a metaphor for working through the easing of conflict between into collaboration with. And then the sandpile model, if we have time, of chaos theory as a visual representation of the ever-evolving working through process. Working through involves a series of steps, iterative healing cycles of disruption and repair, although some of my little friends look none too happy about it. And actually more realistic, and I thank Christine Amos, MD, for this elegant image. More accurately, working through can be visually represented by an ascending spiral staircase, whereby the patient will advance by circling back to places that had previously been seemingly resolved, but that can now be revisited with greater clarity. This metaphor, I don't ever know if it's a metaphor or an analogy or an example or simile, but whatever, I'm going to call it metaphor. This metaphor of the ascending spiral staircase captures beautifully the essence of the ever-evolving working through process, one that is both repetitive and progressive. Repetitive and progressive. Okay, psychodynamic psychotherapy then is a story about providing both impetus and opportunity, albeit belatedly, for now this slide is actually very important, for the graduated transformation of growth disrupting traumatic stressor. Those are from way back. In reaction to which the unevolved child on her own had no choice but to defend, into growth promoting optimal stressor, which is a story about the treatment and what we're offering the patient, in response to which the more evolved adult in treatment and no longer alone will be better able to adapt. So we're doing an interesting, this is simple but profound, that we are transforming traumatic stressor to which the little one had no choice but to defend in order to survive. So in that sense, it was adaptive, but to defend, we are transforming that in the treatment into an optimal stressor to which the adult in treatment and with our support will be better able to adapt. As traumatic stressor eases into optimal stressor, defending to survive will ease into adapting to thrive. And we'll be talking about therapeutic memory reconsolidation in essence, which is what we're really talking about here, the dynamic and ever-evolving nature of memory evolutionarily designed to keep it current and relevant. Indeed, therapeutic modalities that have profound and sustained psychodynamic change as their ultimate goal must ultimately be able to transform low-level defense into higher-level, more evolved defense, in the more traditional words of psychoanalysis and ego psychology, or psychological rigidity into psychological resilience, in the evocative words of ACT, such that the patient, whatever her starting point, maybe terrible traumas, maybe she doesn't have legs, maybe she was raped, maybe she is a rapist, maybe she's a murderer, maybe she this, that, whatever her starting point. It's not specifically about, is the patient going to be able to do this? Wherever they are, surely we ought to be able to help them become ever better able over time to manage a little better the myriad stressors in her life to which she's being continuously exposed, ever more adept at responding adaptively and mindfully instead of reacting defensively and mindlessly. The ultimate goal, ever less psychological rigidity, ever more psychological flexibility. Notice that the stiffest tree is most easily cracked, while the bamboo or willow survives by bending with the wind. And Cami, I hope you like that one as well. All right. So now I've been talking about defenses and adaptations and haven't really explained what I mean. Defenses, rigid, reflexive, mindless, less evolved, self-protective reactions versus adaptations, more flexible, more reflective, not reflexive, but reflective, more mindful, not mindless, more evolved, self-affirming responses. All right. Please note, I don't limit defenses to the well-known and more traditional ones, like repression, denial, dissociation, splitting, projection, somatization, or even stuff like suppression, sublimation, humor, and altruism. Rather, I define defenses more broadly as speaking to any of the self-regulatory mechanisms that we mobilize when made anxious in the face of stressors. Now, I was taught during my training at the Boston Psychoanalytic that everything's all about anxiety. And, you know, and I mean, yes, I learned it, and it's one of the millions of things that I then later sort of lost track of. And it was only sort of in the last, well, since I'm so old, I can say the last few decades, but there are several decades where I've forgotten about it. But the last few decades where I've come to appreciate just how important anxiety really is, and for us to be ever busy keeping our finger on the pulse of the level of the patient's anxiety, and deciding whether or not we think they can tolerate more stress or if they need us to back off. But using their anxiety, the level of their anxiety, too much anxiety, they get defensive. If they can take the stress or more in their stride, I say this in a moment, then they can adapt. So I didn't say that yet, but here we go. So at one end of the continuum, the way I define defenses, what happens reflexively and mindlessly when we're confronted with stressors that overwhelm us with anxiety. And I refer to those as rigid defenses. At the other end, what happens more reflectively and mindfully when we're confronted with stressors that we're more easily able to take in our stride, to which I refer as higher level defenses along the lines of Freud, or more flexible adaptations. So defensive, mindless reactions on the one hand, adaptive, more mindful responses on the other. Response, yep. Reaction, nope. I love this slide. A mindful response, I'm never going to eat that much again, versus, oh, look, food. A mindless reaction. I'm sure we've all sort of the best intentions. Oh, my goodness. Well, there you go. Okay, we cannot avoid stress in our lives, but every day, stress, but we can choose how we cope with it, find meaning in it, and move forward with renewed purpose. Although often misattributed to the existential psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, the actual author is unknown. But here it goes. Between stimulus and response is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Yes, applying this to the clinical situation, between stressor, now I'm saying stimulus, I'm saying stressor, and what follows is a space. In that space is our power. And I believe this. I don't even use the word can't with my patients. I say, for the moment, often put in the temporal element, at the moment, or at this point in time, or right now, they're feeling that they're not yet wanting to go there. That's not where they're determined not to go there. I don't say you can't cry. I say you're not wanting to cry. You're not going to cry right now. I don't say you can't. I don't use the word can. That suggests inability. I think rather they can, but they may be conflicted about exercising their capacity. Okay, so between stressor and what follows is a space. In that space is our power, either to react defensively when the stressor is simply too much for us to manage, or to respond adaptively when we are more easily able to take that stressor in our stride, which will promote our freedom. Not only do we have the power to choose between the two, but we also have the responsibility to do so. Now, I'm going to be contradicting myself in a moment because I'm going to be suggesting that the subversive subconscious that controls 95% of what we do actually takes over all the time. And here I am sort of suggesting we have the power over it. Well, I mean, ultimately, it's for us to gain access over it. So we'll get to that in a moment. It has been suggested that 10% of what happens to us is life, but 90% is how we defensively react or adaptively respond to it. Life is not about defensively waiting for the storm to pass, but adaptively learning to dance in the rain. And again, I always say this here about my dear sweet Gunner. So when I am sort of losing my shit a little bit and I'm upset and something's not working out right and I'm not taking a stressor in my stride, my dear sweet Gunner will say, no, 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 no. Remember the concept that you wrote about, the title of your book, which was The Transformative Power of Optimal Stress, from cursing the darkness to lighting a candle. He'll say, no, no, no. Remember, you want to be lighting a candle. Anyway, so, all right. All right, now the relationship between defense and adaptation, it's a yin-yang relationship. These self-regulatory mechanisms are complementary, not opposing forces. Furthermore, all defenses have an adaptive component, yes, of course, just as all adaptations serve a defensive function. Nonetheless, and more generally, although defenses might once have been necessary for the patient to survive, as rigid defenses evolve into more resilient adaptations, the patient becomes ever better able to thrive. The therapeutic action in second-order deep embodied treatments is indeed designed to transform rigidity into resilience and surviving into thriving. Psychotherapy is designed to transform rigid defense into resilient adaptation. Defenses thwart our growth. Adaptations promote our freedom. Rollo May, the purpose of psychotherapy is to set people free. Freedom is what you do with what's been done to you, Sartre. I'm not what happened to me, I'm what I choose to become, Carl Jung. When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be, said Lao Tzu. I say, when I let go of the defensive, same old that I am, I become the adaptive, something new, different, and better that I might be. All right, so Bruce Lipton, cutting-edge stem cell researcher, briefly on his stuff, because I think it's quite special. He has a particularly compelling way of describing this distinction between the more mindful responses of the conscious mind, propagated by way of nerve impulses generated within the nervous system, and the mindless reactions, oh, look, food, of the unconscious or subconscious. I'm going to be using those two terms more or less interchangeably. Mind. So the mindless reactions of the unconscious or subconscious mind, propagated not by way of nerve impulses generated within the nervous system, but by way of direct currents generated within the ground regulation system. Also described, this ground regulation system, also described as the interstitium, known for decades to forward-thinking researchers, but only officially recognized in 2018 when the interstitium was designated the 80th organ in the human body. It took all of those decades. Body workers had known about the interstitium for decades, but finally it was officially recognized. It's also known as the extracellular matrix, the connective tissue matrix, the biological terrain, the milieu intérieur, the living matrix, the divine matrix, and the mind-body matrix. That's my term, the mind-body matrix. Jim Oshman writes about all of this. Okay, so quickly, the conscious mind responds adaptively and mindfully, but is in charge only 5% of the time. So this is what we're up against, because we're going to talk about the 95% of the time, the subversive subconscious. Information in the conscious mind is processed slowly and thoughtfully by way of nerve impulses generated in the nervous system at the rate of, says Bruce Lipton, 40 bits of data per second. I don't entirely know what that means, but he said it. And he's a researcher, had been at Stanford. We'll go with this. At the rate of 40 bits of data per second. Creative, volitional, intentioned, considered, this is the conscious mind, reflective, mindful, evolved, adaptive. The unconscious, subconscious mind reacts defensively and mindlessly and is in charge 95% of the time. Now, well, okay, I'll say something in a moment. Information here is processed thoughtlessly, but 1 million times faster by way of semiconduction through the liquid crystalline ground regulation system, now recognized by NIH and elsewhere as an organ system in the body, the ground regulation system, at the rate of 40 million bits of data per second, which makes and I'm calling it now, the subversive subconscious mind much more dominant than the well-intentioned conscious mind. Now, let me say, in the subconscious mind are also things that are not subversive. They are the things that enable us to, yeah, if we could admit those people from the waiting room, thank you. There are other things in our subconscious that aren't anxiety provoking, that are just things we don't happen to remember. And I went to a meeting recently of the A4M, and a fellow was talking about, he wanted to call it the X conscious, EX conscious. So stuff that used to be conscious, but that you just don't happen to remember anymore is deep down there. Plus certain things like knowing how to drive a car and certain kinds of muscle memory and all sorts of other things, that's in there too. But I'm talking now about the subversive subconscious, the things that are not so good and don't serve us well. Habitual, conditioned, learned, automatic, knee-jerk, reflexive, mindless, unevolved, defensive. Okay, let's see. Okay, conscious mind 5%, unconscious mind 95%. 95% of your life created by your subconscious mind. The subconscious mind takes control when we are not paying attention, but it also often takes control even when we are. I searched for a long time on Unsplash to find that image, kind of evocative. Okay, now the direct currents generated in the ground regulation system, or the interstitium, the subconscious, are not a result of the relatively slow movement of rather cumbersome ions, sodium and potassium, back and forth across the membrane of a nerve cell that becomes first depolarized and then repolarized as an electrical impulse is conducted down the length of its axon at speeds ranging from 1.5 to 400 feet per second. Oh, that's pretty fast. Rather, the speed of propagation of direct currents through the ground regulation system is closer to the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. Now that's fast, carrying 40 million bits of data per second. Not 40, but 40 million bits. Says Robert Becker, the direct currents making up the body field are not due to charged ions, but instead depend on a mode of semiconduction characteristic of solid-state systems. Life is too rapid and subtle to be explained by slow-moving chemical reactions and nerve impulses, said the avant-garde Albert Sven Georgi. Body consciousness, the ground regulation system, works in tandem with brain consciousness. Witness an amoeba, a one-celled organism, right? We learned about these back in high school, that clearly lacks a nervous system. There it is. There's the amoeba. But look what it can do. For example, its nucleus and ground regulation system that are contained within the body of it, the one cell to one cell, oversee mealtime by prompting pseudopods to extend themselves in order to entrap food particles. Now we can do what an amoeba can do and then some by virtue of our body consciousness working in tandem with our brain consciousness. So there are a lot of one-celled organisms. They don't have the nervous system that we have, but they have a ground regulation system. And therefore the wisdom of their body. And they know how to extend those little foot-like extensions to engulf the little food particle and then digest it. Okay, Bruce Lipton likens our subconscious mind to a quantum computer containing massive amounts of uncensored and unfiltered data, most of which are negative, outdated, maladaptive, self-defeating, and disempowering. Implicitly held beliefs that during the formative years of our lives, when our brains were primarily in a theta brainwave state, like 3 to 7 or 8 cycles per second, and prior to development of our critical faculties, these beliefs, these things are swallowed whole, messages are swallowed whole and like software programs, downloaded onto the hard drive of the quantum computer that is our subconscious. Thereafter, and generally unbeknownst to us, these subversive narratives will organize our experience of self, others, and the world, and control most of what we think, feel, and do. And this is what we hear from our patients, and this is what goes on inside of us sometimes. These narratives downloaded early on as if they were absolute facts. I'm a failure, I'm not smart enough, I'm a victim, I've already tried everything, I'll never get better, I'll always be sick, I'll never be happy, I'm too old, I've already made too many mistakes, it's too late. We've all heard so many of our patients saying that, and we've all ourselves felt those things sometimes. Now about people just don't understand. People are always judging. I hate how critical people are. People always hurt you. People always disappoint. People never deliver. The world's a dangerous place. You shouldn't trust anybody. These are the old, bad, disempowering, distorted narratives that were downloaded early on. And this is what we're up against. And this is what we're wanting with second order, deep embodied psychodynamic change to impact. Okay, healing involves, so most of the majority of the beliefs and programs that adults have were received from others during their formative years. And the more often the messages were repeated, the more deeply ingrained did the beliefs become. In other words, usually we do not consciously decide what we believe. Healing, therefore, necessarily involves unlearning or unbelieving all of the subversive narratives that early on were downloaded into our subconscious mind and that thereafter limited or deterred us in our pursuit of mental and physical well-being. Okay. All right. Now, Freud. Freud uses the metaphor of horse and rider to explain the working through process. And as I continue to evolve in my understanding of the working through process, he said, of course, remembering, repeating, and working through. Anyway, I go back periodically to revisit what Freud had written. It's like, my God, he was already saying that stuff. You know, it took me decades I'd even read him before, decades to sort of like get, the brilliance in what he was saying. And again, the interpretive perspective of classical psychoanalytic theory goes in my Model 1. And over the decades, I added Model 2, Model 3, Model 4, Model 5, a decade for each. So in the 1970s, Model 1, 1980s, self-psychology, Model 2, 1990s, when I became more acquainted with the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory, then I had to add Model 3. Model 4 came on board between 2000 and 2010, the existential humanistic approach to nurturing surrender to a new beginning. And then Model 5, the quantum neuroscientific, which is a late addition here. And I know that a few people are still unmuted, so maybe selectively mute them if the person in charge of that could do that. I'd appreciate that. Okay, as we shall soon see, the problem always holds elements of the solution. That is profound. And I only sort of understood that a little bit. Freud was writing about it, but I only really understood it when I went to some of the short-term intensive psychodynamic treatment conferences where they're all about that. And they highlight that and so like, I guess that's right. The problem always holds elements of the solution. So this is here's Freud. Freud's horse and rider is indeed an apt metaphor for the working through process whereby the id, the horse, is tamed and the ego, the rider, is strengthened, such that rigid defense becomes no longer as necessary and can be gradually replaced by more resilient adaptation. So initially, Freud's inexperienced rider and undeveloped ego will be made anxious by her untamed horse, a dysregulated id. But as a result of training, the rider and the horse, Freud's now more experienced and more empowered rider, a now stronger and more developed ego, will be better able to take in stride her now tamer horse, a now better regulated id. That is the working through process. Instead of defensively reining her horse in, the rider will now be able adaptively to give her horse free rein and to harness its power by channeling its now more modulated energy into more constructive endeavors and healthier pursuits. Conflict between easing into collaboration with, as horse and cowgirl ride off together into the sunset. Think sublimation. Freud's young child, once playing recklessly with knives, but now a world-class surgeon who cuts with mindful precision and expert finesse. And here's our cowgirl, more or less a cowgirl. Out of your vulnerabilities will come your strength, Freud. Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries, Carl Jung. And throughout my presentation, this isn't about getting rid of anything, but rather working with it and fashioning it and evolving it. Okay, so my psychodynamic synergy paradigm, a C.A.R.E.S, because we care, approach to deep embodied healing. So I wanted my eyes on the time, and let me think about how I want to do this. Okay. So I'm going to say this stuff real quick, so you can have it as a reference. These are 5 interactive and mutually enhancing modes of therapeutic action, all of which capitalize upon the use of optimal stress to incentivize deep healing. In no particular order other than when first I became familiar with each approach. Model 1, the interpretive perspective of classical psychoanalysis. Model 2, the corrective provision or deficiency compensation perspective of self-psychology and other object relations models that speak to deficit, structural deficit. Model 3, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory. And as we will see, model 2 is more about deficit, absence of good. The internal record, the price paid as a result of absence of good. It's a structural deficit. And so there needs to be corrective provision or deficiency compensation. That's what self-psychology is, deficit model, and how we fill in deficit and add new good. Model 3 is not about absence of good, how that's internally recorded, but presence of bad, and how that's internally recorded in the form of internal bad objects, pathogenic introjects, these charged toxic boluses of toxicity that are swallowed whole. We've just been talking about that. So this is more about the presence of bad. And now we're going to see, whereas model 2 is going to be a lot about grieving, and thereby transmutingly internalizing, i.e. structure building, the good that's out there, that had been out there part of the empathic failure, and internalizing that to fill in deficit. So adding new good and filling in deficit and becoming more whole. In model 3, it's about these charged toxic boluses, these pathogenic introjects, many of them in pairs, being played out on the stage of the treatment and in one's life. These unmastered early on relational traumas that are being continuously, compulsively, and unwittingly reenacted on the stage of one's life. And when that happens in the treatment, we'll be talking a lot about projective identification. And ultimately, instead of adding new good, we're going to be talking about modifying old bad such that it's no longer as toxic. So this is the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory. It involves, in the words of Darlene Ehrenberg, negotiating at the intimate edge of toxic relatedness when charged toxic things get delivered into the relationship with the therapist. Model 4, an existential humanistic approach to fostering surrender. Masood Khan talks about helping the patient overcome their dread of surrender to resourceless dependence, and facilitating access to the private or true self, in the words of Winnicott. So false self on the one hand, the public social false self on the one hand, and the true or private self on the other. And this is more existential humanistic approach. And then model 5, a quantum neuroscientific approach to overcoming analysis paralysis. When the patient has already acquired model 1 awareness, model 2 acceptance, model 3 accountability, model 4 authentic presence and accessibility. And yet there's analysis paralysis. The patient is just incredibly stuck. So this model 5 is a quantum neuroscientific approach to overcoming analysis paralysis and neural entrenchment. Model 6, a holistic approach to optimizing mind-body health. And when I present this, I guess kind of threw that in there as a teaser, because that's going to be 2020 to 2030, but we're only in 2024 now. So I have 6 more years to develop this. But this is where my integrative medicine part of me comes into play. And this is a coming attraction, my model 6. Although everybody here, I present my first 5 models and everybody says, I want to hear about model 6. Well, what about our models 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? So anyway, all right, let me just do this. Okay, so here we go. So now you know why I say C.A.R.E.S. Cognitive, the C, cognitive, enhancement of knowledge within. 2, affective, provision of experience. 4, model 3, relational, engagement in relationship with. Notice the prepositions. Model 4, existential, fostering of surrender to a new beginning, to analytic oneness. 2, synaptic, model 5, envisioning of possibilities beyond. And so it comes out as C.A.R.E.S. And were I to be adding then this 6th model, which is the holistic approach, that really would be truly more about the somatic component. And then my psychodynamic synergy paradigm will become a C.A.R.E.S.S, a C.A.R.E.S approach to deep healing, and that should work. So anyway, here I am offering my PSP presentation to BSPS. And it is my pleasure. Thank you, Cami, and thank you, board, and thank you, Bill. Okay, so it's an integrative approach to deep embodied healing. Yes, second order, transformational, discontinuous quantum change. One that involves the complex interplay of all 5 models, each gaining momentum by virtue of advancement in the other 4. In essence, the models are interdependent, none more important than any of the others. No, you don't do model 1 or model 2 to create a safe place, and model 1 some interpretation, and model 3 negotiating at the intimate edge. No, no, no. Back and forth, not really seamlessly, because as therapists, we're never really seamless, but there's a sort of back and forth between amongst all 5 of them. The subversive undertow. Okay, just a few little cute things to help you remember. The subversive undertow, specific to each of the 5 models, the 5 N's, so the N word. So model 1, oh, well, first of all, let me say, model 1 then, for those of you who were trained a little more in classical psychoanalytic, you'll understand here then structural conflict, neurotic, intrapsychic structural conflict. Between id impulse pressing yes, ego defense countering no. Model 2, structural deficit, impaired capacity. Model 3, relational conflict. Stephen Mitchell and others have described it as that, relational conflict. Model 4, relational deficit. And it was my dear friend Larry Hedges is the one who made me add model 4 to my psychodynamic synergy paradigm. He knew my system well enough that he knew what was missing. And so he was like, I was a little bit rigid, quite frankly, but he was sort of in my face about you got structural conflict, you got structural deficit, you got relational conflict, you got to have relational deficit. So finally, I said, okay. And we figured out a way for me to add model 4, relational deficit. And I am so glad I did. My model is so much stronger as a result. And I sort of feel I might have to go back to apologize to some of my patients whom I'd seen during the first decades of my work, because I wasn't as attuned to what I've since come to be attuned to. And then more recently, model 5, the analysis paralysis. All right, but the 5 N's. This is more backdrop. I don't tend to use diagnosis, but I do a little bit here. So model 1 is neurotic conflictedness, the jammed up, structural conflict, jammed up, intrapsychic, one-person conflict. Model 2, narcissistic vulnerability. narcissistic, the self-psychology, narcissistic vulnerability, narcissistic woundedness, narcissistic injury. So that's where the backdrop is narcissistic vulnerability. And these can change over the course of a treatment, but they tend to be sort of in the backdrop. Model 3, noxious relatedness, because when you're ever busy playing out compulsively and unwittingly on the stage of the treatment and in your relationships, your unmastered early on relational traumas, noxious relatedness, you're busy playing stuff out. And we think sometimes of character disorders, whereas model 1 is more neurotic, model 3 more character disorders, where you're making the people around you suffer. Model 1, only you tend to suffer. Model 3, you make others around you suffer with your passive aggression or what have you. Okay, model 4, non-relatedness. So Arne Modell talks about affective non-relatedness, and Masud Khan and Guntrip and Fairbairn, non-relatedness. And then finally, model 5, non-actualization, non-actualizing, non-action. So patients who've been in treatment, they've been in analysis for years, they say, oh my God, I know so much more now, I have so much insight, things are so different. And we meanwhile look at them and we're thinking like, my God, you're as fucked up as ever. You're not doing anything differently in your life. You're still in that bad marriage, you still haven't advanced in your career, and you're still sick all the time. But oh no, they're getting a lot out of their analysis. So model 5, and this is more informed by the short-term intensive approaches of some of those there short-term intensive folks who do a damn good job of things. And they do a damn good job of things. So I've lifted some stuff from them, and I had some training myself in some of the short-term stuff. I do EMDR, not terribly well. I read my sheets of paper, but I do EMDR, and I trained with Al Paso and Pat Ogden, sensory motor psychotherapy. And I do have some training in some of the short-term intensive ones. And I pulled all that together, and ACT, and I pulled that together, and IFS, and made that into my model 5. Okay. The working through, okay, basically from less evolved to more evolved, iterative healing cycles of disruption and repair. So we've got, and again, for ease of remembering, 5 defenses, the 5 R's, and the 5 adaptations, 5 A's. So here we go. Model 1, evolving from the defense, resistance, like resistance, to awareness. Now, I could have said insight, but insight starts with an I. And so I can't say insights, I have to say awareness. So adaptive awareness, now look at what follows, of anxiety-provoking truths about the self, one's internal landscape. So from resistance, what is that really? Resistance to insight, resistance to awareness of anxiety-provoking, because it makes you too anxious to realize you really wanted your daddy, or you really wanted to kill your mommy, or you want to devour, or whatever. So from defensive resistance to adaptive awareness of anxiety-provoking truths about the self and one's internal landscape. Model 2, evolving from my term relentless hope, which speaks to a refusal to confront and grieve the reality of the object's limitations, separateness, and immutability. So that's relentless hope. It speaks to a refusal to grieve. All right, so evolving from defensive relentless hope to adaptive acceptance. That one worked well, of anxiety-provoking truths about the object, the significant object, the object of one's desire, whether it's the boss or one's partner or the child or the parent or the therapist. Relentless hope. Model 3, evolving from defensive, compulsive, and unwitting reenactment. So repetition compulsion is a little more relevant for model 1. You're ever busy, ever busy, ever busy, being conflicted, conflicted, conflicted. Model 3, you're ever busy reenacting, meaning you're playing it out in real life on the stage of the treatment. And that's why character disordered and makes it more unpleasant for others. From compulsive and unwitting reenactment of unmastered early on relational traumas to adaptive accountability. So it's not like you never do it, but when you do, there's the capacity, the adaptive capacity, not the defensive need to sort of not hold oneself responsible or to take ownership, but rather the adaptive capacity to hold oneself accountable. Accountability, there's the A word, for anxiety-provoking truths about the self in relation. It's a term used by the Stone Center at Wellesley College, or the relational self, as it's sometimes called, but the self in relation, what you're ever busy playing out. And model 4, evolving from defensive relational absence, retreat to adaptive authentic presence, or, and I had to work on this for a while, authentic access to anxiety-provoking truths about the private self, about the true self. And finally, evolving from defensive refractory inertia to adaptive actualization, there's your A word, there's the adaptation, of anxiety-provoking truths about the envisioned self, or the possible self, or the future self. Where you have trouble, it's anxiety-provoking to be thinking about what it could be like for you if you weighed the right, and if you had the good relationship, and if you were evolved in your career, and if you had good health, and you had better relationships, and so on and so forth. So actualization of anxiety-provoking truths about the envisioned self. And there are 5 optimal stressors, the 5 Ds. I'll just say this real quick. Model 1, cognitive dissonance. See, it's cognitive because it's privileges cognition. Model 1, cognitive dissonance. We use that in Model 1, cognitive dissonance. When the contrast between the pain and the gain is such that there's the internal tension, homeostatic imbalance, and dissonance, affective and cognitive dissonance. Model 2, you're working through, this one was easy. Self-psychology, they call it optimal disillusionment, and that's fine. So I'll call it optimal affective disillusionment because it privileges affect. So from relentless hope to acceptance by working through the optimal stress of affective disillusionment. Model 3, from reenactment to accountability by working through the optimal stress, often by way of projective identification, of existential dependence. I'm sorry. Yes. Did I say that right? Okay. Did I might have skipped reenactment to accountability, relational detoxification, so that the patient, it's the charged toxic boluses become less toxic. The serial dilution of the introjected toxicity, serial dilution, whereas Model 2 is serial accretion of new good. Model 3 is serial dilution of old bad. Isn't that kind of cool? Okay, Model 4, from relational absence or retreat to authentic presence or accessibility or emotional availability by working through the optimal stress of existential dependence. So, and it could be called resourceless dependence. That's what Masood Khan calls it. Winnicott calls it absolute dependence. Some of the others call it therapeutic dependence. I'm calling it existential dependence. I came home after talking to Larry Hedges out there in LA. And when he told me I had to add Model 4 and sort of like, all right, well, what am I going to use as the D word for the optimal stressor? And so we were thinking, well, infantile dependence, or like, well, okay, I don't like it that much, but okay. Then I thought, as I was on the airplane coming back to Boston, I thought, well, what about existential dependence? I'm going to make up that term, existential dependence. And then I came home and I Googled it and quote, existential dependence, and found out that that's exactly a term that's used in the existential literature. And it means depending upon another for one's very existence. They're like, well, and that's exactly what we're talking about in Model 4, where we invite people to regress, and we want to facilitate their regression. Model 5, from refractory inertia to actualizing action by working through the optimal stress of synaptic deconditioning. So we're trying to unlearn and unbelieve those things that have been downloaded early on. The narratives, the old, bad, disempowering, maladaptive narratives. This is really too complicated. But let me say, someone pointed out to me, Martha, then, in essence, your psychodynamic synergy paradigm is an approach to working through that is RAD. 5 defenses are, 5 adaptations A, and 5 optimal stressors D. So this is just repeat. Okay. And so the 5 corrective challenges, this is the repeat of the slide you've seen at the beginning, and I hope it makes more sense to you now. 5 corrective challenges. Model 1, new corrective information. Conflict statements we'll be using. Model 2, new corrective experience. We'll be using empathic statements, kind of, and disillusionment statements. Model 3, new corrective relationship. Model 4, new corrective beginning, a new beginning. And Model 5, new corrective possibilities. So I just want you to be able to be feeling the importance of creating these disconfirmatory, as they're called, mismatch experiences between what had been and what could be, between old bad and new good, between the sobering and conditioned reality of what is and the envisioned and quantum possibility of what could be. And that we're creating tension, internal tension, homeostatic imbalance by challenging and supporting, challenging by highlighting this and supporting by resonating with this. Again, harkening back to Alexander and French's groundbreaking at the time corrective emotional experience. Okay, and this is the name of the statements, and we're going to do more of these later. I'm looking at the time. So conflict statements in Model 1. I gave you an example earlier on. Disillusionment statements to facilitate grieving. Oh, so Model 1's about interpreting in the way that we would think of it, interpreting. And it's more cognitive, and it privileges that. Of course, it uses all sorts of everything, but it privileges interpreting, and so we use conflict statements. You do know that, but you find yourself feeling. So challenge and then support. You do know that, anxiety-provoking challenge, but you find yourself defensively feeling that or doing or telling yourself. Model 2, disillusionment statements. Those are to facilitate grieving and affective disillusionment. So we can have the serial accretion by way of transmuting, which means structure building, internalizations of the good that had been there in the self-object prior to the empathic failure, thereby filling in deficit. So we do disillusionment statements that go 3 parts. You had so hoped that I would give you the answers, but are finding that that's not really what happens in here. And it enrages you, and it's upsetting, and it's devastating. So 3 parts. You had so hoped, there you name the illusion, but now you name the reality that they're beginning to recognize. And now you resonate with the affect they feel as they begin to confront that reality. So disillusionment statements to facilitate grieving, which will enable then there to be accretion of new good and building up of structure so that structural deficit becomes filled in. Model 3, we do the Darlene Ehrenberg's negotiating at the intimate edge of the vicissitudes that will sort of get played out on the stage of the treatment, the brambles in the space between, the intersubjective space, the in-between, negotiating at the intimate edge when there's a mutual enactment and transference, countertransference, entanglements. And now we do accountability statements or relational interventions because we want ultimately for the therapist to lend aspects of her own more evolved capacity to tolerate what the patient cannot and must instead defend against. And hopefully the therapist will be able to provide the containment and ultimately hold herself accountable for the part she's playing in the mutual enactment that's being played out, the crunch situations, in Paul Russell's words, the crunch situations that are being played out in the space, the intersubjective space between, as they negotiate at the intimate edge and gradually then detoxify the toxicity. And I always think about how in high school in chemistry, you have a beaker of water and you put ink, blue ink into the beaker. And so the water becomes kind of dark blue. But then you take that beaker and pour it into a larger beaker of water. And now it's still blue, but less so. It's become diluted. And serially, you dilute the toxicity, the blue ink, so that eventually it's hardly blue at all. And that's what we're doing in essence. So model 2 is about absence of good. In other words, deprivation and neglect. And model 3 is about trauma and abuse, the internal record of which will be these charged toxic internal boluses that get then delivered into the relationship. If all goes well, if the patient feels safe enough, and if this then can be negotiated at the intimate edge and worked through such that what goes back in is now slightly detoxified before it's yet again. It's an amalgam, as Winnicott would say, an amalgam of the old bad and now the new good that the therapist has been able to add by virtue of her capacity to contain and to hold herself accountable instead of just participating in the enactment. Okay, that was model 3. Model 4, we're talking about fostering surrender, regression to redo, benign regression to redo, permission given for the patient to regress so that there can be an opportunity for there to be a new beginning, Michael Bolland, a new beginning, over Eschel's analytic oneness. And it involves, as Masood Khan has said, overcoming the dread of surrender to resourceless dependence on the part of the patient, yes, but also ultimately, according to Karen Marotta, on the part of the therapist as well. It's deep, profound work. And the optimal stressor is, people will say, well, where's the optimal stressor? Well, that's facilitating the patient's capacity eventually to be able to surrender to depending upon someone and letting them really matter, someone whom you've come to trust fundamentally. And we use facilitation statements, an example of which would be a part of you, on some level, you want desperately to be seen, known, heard, understood. But another part of you is terrified of being found, where you pick up on the ambivalence they feel about being in relationship, about having moments of meaningful meeting, about being found. Okay, and model 5, refractory inertia or rut or rootedness to the spot, evolving into actualizing action. This involves, again, violating expectations. So what they had thought, same old, conditioned, yup, Now we're going to violate that expectation and create a jolting, startling, sort of like disconfirmatory. And here we really see the mismatch experiences. And I'll be talking a little bit later, more specifically about therapeutic memory reconsolidation, which is especially and very obviously relevant for model 5, though it's relevant for all 5 models. And we use quantum disentanglement statements. The second part of which, when the first part, they talk about the old bad, and in a really heartfelt, vulnerable, embodied way, their experience of the horror of what it was, the presence of bad and the absence of good, all those traumatic stressors growing up, and what they then had to do in order to survive. But in the second part, that's the old bad, affective, embodied, felt, sense, lived, implicit bodily knowing that. But in the second part, there's 3 parts. Now, this is, remember, envisioning of possibilities beyond. So the second part of the quantum disentanglement statement, the first part is for them to be able to envision the possibility of what they would want, who they would want to be, what they would want to have, to envision what they could be if they could but let themselves envision it, visualize it. The second part is taking ownership of their need, therefore, to change how they position themselves in relation to their lives. They need to change. You know, in the psychodynamic, psychoanalytic work that I did and that I was trained to do at the Boston Psychoanalytic, I would never have suggested to a patient that she needs to think about changing. I mean, I would never. That would be sacrilegious. Like, I mean, you don't suggest that. In model 5, permission is given, in my model 5 anyway, for permission is explicit permission given for us to do what actually many of us probably already do anyway, which is sort of to suggest, well, listen, honey, you know, if you really want to get that weight off, you're going to have to do a little something about it and not just be busy complaining about it. I mean, not that we would say it that way, but in model 5, we are a little more directive, and we do encourage them to envision what they would want, to acknowledge that they will therefore need to reposition themselves and change how they're living and what they're doing. And the third part is thereby committing to acting in alignment with their vision. And when it turns out that that's a little too much for them, that's fine. We go back to models 1, 2, 3, 4. That's fine. And then we slip into model 5 when we think we can, then back to models 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Okay, here we go. Okay, these 5 models in my psychodynamic synergy paradigm, classical psychoanalytic, self-psychological, contemporary relational, existential humanistic, and quantum neuroscientific, are designed to serve as a conceptual framework for both teasing out the patient's predominant, underlying, and more enduring psychodynamic traits, and that's the subversive undertow, as either, and these are the 5 N's, neurotic, narcissistic, noxious, non-related, non-actualized. That's the underlying psychodynamic trait. And moment to moment, directing the therapist's immediate focus to the patient's transient and ever-shifting psychodynamic state, the points of emotional urgency, as Robert Mailman, one of my dear supervisors, would talk to me about, the points of emotional urgency that are fraught as either resistant, relentlessly hopeful, reenacting, retreating, or rooted to the spot. In other words, my psychodynamic synergy paradigm, PSP, provides a framework for both the background traits, the 5 N's, and the foreground states, the 5 R's, of psychodynamic treatments and synergy. I bought that from Shutterstock because it captures in a nutshell what my approach is all about. All right, a brief vignette, okay, called The Sharing of Grief, that highlights the clinical distinction between defensive need on the part of the patient and, in this case, adaptive capacity on the part of the therapist. And so this is, because it focuses in more on between the two of them, this is an example of model 3, projective identification in action. It's a very quiet little something. So model 3, intersubjective perspective approach to of contemporary relational theory doesn't always involve a lot of noise and a lot of huge back and forth fighting. It can sometimes be a much more subtle something that's happening in the in-between, in the space between these two authentic subjects in relationship, intersubjectivity in relationship. This vignette demonstrates subtle corrective challenge, thank goodness, a corrective challenge, which is my whole point here, of the patient's defensive need not to feel, with the therapist's adaptive capacity to feel. That's going to create then this corrective challenge in the relationship, in the context of the relationship, which results in at least a temporary, this alone didn't sort of change the whole patient, but in at least a temporary increase in adaptive capacity on the part of the patient. Model 3, projective identification in action. Here we go. It's very simple. The patient's beloved grandmother has just died. The patient, unable to feel his sadness because it hurts too much, recounts in a monotone. So hurts too much sort of suggests defense, right? Recounts in a monotone the details of his grandmother's death. As the therapist listens, she becomes very sad. As the patient continues, the therapist finds herself uttering, almost inaudibly, an occasional, "Oh no," and "That's awful." As the hour progresses, the patient himself becomes increasingly sad. There you have it. That was a projective identification. The therapist's capacity to feel challenging the patient's need not to. Here we go. In this example, the patient is initially unable to feel the depths of his grief about his grandmother's death. But by reporting the details of her death in the monotonic manner in which he does, that's the exerting of interpersonal pressure that Malin and Grotstein have talked about as being relevant for the, what I call the induction phase of a projective identification. So the reporting of the details of the death in a monotonic manner is the exerting of interpersonal pressure on the therapist to accept something that the patient finds intolerable. In this case, it's not pairs, it's an intolerable state, an intolerable affect or emotion. The patient is, by doing that, the patient is able to get the therapist to feel what he himself cannot and instead must defend against. In essence, the patient exerts interpersonal pressure upon the therapist to take on as the therapist's own what the patient does not yet have the capacity to tolerate. As the therapist sits with the patient and listens to his story, she finds herself becoming very sad, which signals the therapist's quiet acceptance of the patient's disavowed grief. This is the induction phase of the projective identification. We could say of the patient's sadness that it has found its way into the therapist, who, able to tolerate what the patient finds intolerable and needs to defend against and project, takes it on as her own. The therapist's sadness is therefore co-created, in part a story about the patient and his disavowed grief, and in part a story about the therapist, in whom a resonant chord has been struck. So the countertransference is co-created, in part a story about the here and now of the therapeutic engagement and the there and then of the therapist's past the therapist's state of being. The therapist, with her greater capacity to experience affect without needing to defend against it, is able both to tolerate the sadness that the patient finds intolerable and to process and integrate it, which will usher in the resolution phase, my word, of the projective identification. The therapist feels it, but is not overwhelmed by it. So call the therapist semi-permeable, not impermeable. And I know I was taught sort of like, well, at model 1, this is true, countertransference. If thy get countertransference, thy must get thyself off to thy supervisor and perhaps even thy therapist to deal with thy countertransference. In model 3, we allow for the therapist as an authentic subject, intersubjectivity, as an authentic subject in authentic relationship with the patient. We allow for and permission for and invite the therapist to bring herself into the room and to take on as her own different things that are happening on the stage of the treatment. So we don't call her impermeable because then there won't be opportunity to do model 3 work, nor do we call her necessarily totally permeable and she gets totally overwhelmed and it just can't provide any containment or hold herself accountable for her reactivity. So semi-permeable is how I like to think of the therapist as the ideal stance. It is the therapist's ability to tolerate the intolerable, because she's semi-permeable and has taken it in, that makes the patient's previously unmanageable feelings more manageable for him. Indeed, the patient's grief becomes less terrifying by virtue of the fact that the therapist has been able to carry that grief on the patient's behalf. A more assimilable version of the patient's sadness is then returned to the patient in the form of the therapist's heartfelt utterances, "Oh no, and that's awful." I make a distinction between authentic engagement, which is a story about model 3, and empathic attunement, which is a story about model 2. I don't call this, I don't. Some people take issue and some people love this distinction. But anyway, I myself don't call this empathic attunement. I call it authentic engagement. She actually, and it was actually me, she actually feels it. She takes it on as her own and feels, "Oh no, and that's awful." She's not just being empathic and taking it on as if it were her own. No, it becomes her own. But then she's able quietly, subtly to process and integrate it and in essence to return a more digested form to the patient in the form of, "Oh no, and that's awful." Now she doesn't go, "Oh no, that's just awful." That would be too permeable. And nor does she say, "Oh, tell me how you feel about it," or "Is there something more that you might be feeling?" That'd be impermeable, but rather semi-permeable, such that the patient finds himself now able to bear the pain of his own grief, now able to carry that pain on his own behalf, now able to tolerate what had once been intolerable for him. So from defensive reaction on his part to more adaptive response, being able to sit with and be present with, by virtue of the therapist's provision of a model 3 corrective relational experience. So these things happen, they're lovely something, a lovely something. These can happen. There are also things that are not so lovely that are negotiated at the intimate edge in model 3. All right, so let's see, my eyes on the time. So I think then I'm going to say this real quick and then we're going to take a 15-minute break. How about that? So, and so quick that I might not even say it. I'm not even going to say it. I like this one. We don't get wounded alone and we don't heal alone. Carl Jung. Yeah, and so we are going to start. Why don't we? Okay, but what I would like to do now, and I see all of you good people, does anybody, we are going to take a 15-minute break, but does anybody have a pressing question in the moment about what I've presented? And if so, just raise your hand and we will unmute you and then you can ask me. And you might not, you may be still digesting and processing this. No hands. And in the chat, let me see. I'm going to read this because Ed wrote this. Oh, thank you, Ed. As a regular participant in the SPOT supervision, let me say it has been remarkably insightful with many applications for the clients I have presented twice and from those presented by colleagues. It is a great event every week, with Martha's input and the great work of those who present. Highest recommendation. Oh my God. Thank you so much, Ed. I appreciate that. Oh, and there was a message for me to please unmute myself. Oh, you can't hear anything. Oh dear, yeah. Yeah, sorry about that. All right, so listen, we're going to, the big hand is on the 9, on my clock anyway. And so we're going to come back when the big hand is on the 12, whatever your time zone might be. Jenny has a different time zone. And we will start promptly at 12 noon. So bye-bye for now.
So we can, we'll just leave it here,
Mhm.
yes. And, okay,
Just leave.
that's cool.
Yeah.
She really,
Mhm.
she's, that's Martha. Most integrated psychologists and psychiatrists out there. And she's really popular and teaching circuit. Just to let you know, Martha Stark, she's
Yes.
integrating an enormous amount of information. If you didn't know this already, from a psychological point of view. Okay, yeah.
It's interesting, but I don't know much about the topics.
Yeah, it's gotta be overwhelming, I think, to you. I mean, it's almost overwhelming to me. And I've been a psychologist for 45 years. She goes so fast and she's integrating so much material. But I just look at it, it's brilliant stuff. And she's a big name. And we're sort of finishing our season on a high note. That's, that was the plan. So
If you consider all the things that she was saying.
thank you for doing all these little tasks. Yeah, I think I saw 35 is our number. You know, or no, this one.
That's a strategy for what they said.
I got it.
It's two, ratings. It's two severe for me.
And we've also got we've got 5 in the room.
I didn't get them rid of it, so.
Everyone's got those. A woman and a pink. Okay, thank you. I'll be back in a few minutes.
Right, but I was saying to them, if you do all of that, you will listen to your patient.
Oh, well, you've got to have it so cool in yourself.
That would be her.
Well, or just one for
Right. No, she is actually brilliant.
that's stuff that really inspires me. Because he's saying so much.
Yes, yes. And I think she's that effective with the patient. I believe she's that,
I would think so too.
yeah.
She's sort of leadership really is inspiring, isn't it?
Yeah, I remember that from the last time. Because kids are like that, you know, they do things that are, daring and egocentric. But I mean, that's a tragedy, it's quite incredible. You know.
So that's how it used to look like?
Yeah, she's, down in Florida now, and I think she gets a lot of treatments.
Skin and hair treatments?
Yes, you can see it. You know, she She sent me, and when she sent all her material, she said she's recently retired from Harvard after 45 years, you know. So this morning, she emails me, I was almost out the door. She emails me and she says, I don't want you to say I am retired. Recording is turned off, isn't it?
Sure, from YouTube, but.
Yeah.
Whatever. Oh, yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much. Great day. Great day.
Thank you, Ed.
I'll
Thanks
get
for
the
letting
rest
me
when I
know.
get home or
See you
tomorrow.
Thursday. See you
Yes,
Thursday.
for sure. Bye
Oh,
now.
good. Oh, good. Okay, we're going to get started shortly. Are we back to being recorded?
Yes.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Oh, good. And this time, forgive me, I will check. I can easily unmute myself, and I'm so sorry. Everybody had been muted, and I didn't know that I was still muted. So, all right. So, shall we get started again? Okay, good. So, can you see that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Oh, good. Wait, I want to make sure I can still see Bill. Bill Kerwan. Okay. All right. Yeah, on my screen. I just want to make sure. Okay. Hello, Roseanne. All right. Let me just wait a minute. Wait. I'm sorry. I'm just doing a little something here. Okay. All right. So picking up again. So Model 5. And you can hear me and you can see me. Okay, good. Hi. All right. And I know this is a lot of material. Oh, and I want to clarify because I know some of us heard during the break. I'm trying to get myself to retire from Harvard Medical School, where I've been since 1965 when I went off to Harvard undergrad. And so that I can pursue some of my other psychoanalytic passions, including my psychodynamics energy paradigm, and starting up again my own CME CE continuing education program for mental health professionals. But I haven't quite been able to get myself to extricate myself from Harvard. So for now, I guess I'm still there. So, all right, along with other things. Okay, so Model 5, a quantum neuroscientific approach to healing. A quantum neuroscientific approach to healing, one that relies upon the brain-based strategy of therapeutic memory reconsolidation to rewire structurally the brain and reprogram functionally the mind. So, in the words of Søren Kierkegaard, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So, the psychoanalytically informed models 1 to 4, I would like to suggest, are about understanding life backwards. In other words, analyzing to understand. The brain-based Model 5 is about living life forwards, envisioning possibilities to incentivize action. And the name of my most recent book was indeed well, the subtitle was Analyzing to Understand and Envisioning Possibilities to Incentivize Action. And I guess the title was Life Can Only Be Understood Backwards, but It Must Be Lived Forwards, I guess was the title. And the subtitle was Analyzing to Understand, but Envisioning Possibilities to Incentivize Action. Okay. All right. Models 1 to 4, long-term, broad-based approaches that are psychoanalytically informed, directly or indirectly, but psychoanalytically informed. Model 5, short-term, intensive approach, informed by ACT, ISTDP, AEDP, IFS, EMDR, psychomotor psychotherapy, Alpesos, somatic experiencing, Peter Levine's, sensory motor psychotherapy, Pat Ogden, emotional freedom techniques, Sue Johnson, emotion-focused therapy, Sue Johnson, emotional freedom techniques. I don't know, a lot of people. Core process psychotherapy, a lot of people in the UK do that, to name a few. The recent edition of Model 5, which is a targeted, unlike Models 1 to 4, Model 5, which is a targeted, problem-oriented, solution-focused, goal-directed, future-oriented, and action-based approach. So different from Models 1, 2, 3, 4. The recent addition of Model 5 to my psychodynamics energy paradigm, almost 30 years after the first models were conceived, is in the tradition of Freud's eventual and humble acknowledgement that, in order to broaden its effectiveness and its range of applicability, the pure gold of analysis might well need to be alloyed with the copper of direct suggestion and hypnotic influence. Freud said that. When you're always looking back, you can't see what's coming. 2020 Kia SUV, an ad on TV that I kept seeing. Whereas the psychoanalytically informed models 1 to 4 focus on the relationship between past and present, the more goal-directed model 5 focuses on the relationship between present and future. Whereas models 1 to 4 require of the patient that she take ownership of her past, model 5 requires of the patient that she take ownership of her future. Whereas models 1 to 4 are about looking back and remembering so that old bad will not be recreated in the present. Model 5 is about looking ahead and envisioning so that new good can be created for the future. Paraphrasing only slightly the words of the psychologist and coach Carol Kaufman. As a psychodynamic therapist, I follow the trail of tears to healing. As a coach, I follow the trail of dreams to actualization. Similarly, models 1 to 4 strive to facilitate, often by way of grieving, the in-depth healing of relational scars and emotional injuries deriving from the past. Whereas model 5 aims to facilitate focused action specifically designed to actualize potential and realize dreams. Or as Carol Kaufman says, as a coach, I follow the trail of dreams to actualization. But I believe that model 5, in as much as it's included in my psychodynamic synergy paradigm, that I mean, I don't know what coach means, but I want it also to be speaking to deep, embodied psychodynamic change, model 5, as with models 1, 2, 3, 4. Whereas models 1 to 4 are in the tradition of understanding our history as our destiny, which we are condemned to repeat unless we can remember it and work it through. Model 5 focuses on our destiny as our choice, which is ours to create if we can but take embodied ownership of our need to change, can release ourselves from the old, outdated, disempowering, distorted, maladaptive narratives that have energetically or quantumly entangled us with our past, and can commit to constructing for ourselves, I do hereby commit to constructing for ourselves new, updated, more empowering, more reality-based, more adaptive narratives going forward. So many of our patients, will find themselves reluctant to think about, to envision possibilities for the future, and will find themselves wanting to sort of talk about, and this is fine, but if it's all they do, then potentially we're just reinforcing old bad. But they find themselves wanting to talk about all of what they've been through, which is fine. But again, ultimately, we need to be introducing as a corrective new information, experience, relationship, beginning, and possibilities if we're to bring about deep second order change. Models 1 to 4, our history is our destiny, kind of deterministic. Model 5, our destiny is our choice. If you do not change direction, you may end up where you are heading. Lao Tzu. A slight paraphrase of Eleanor Roosevelt. The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams and have the courage to pursue them. I've come to feel that something that doesn't get emphasized as much as I wish it would is on the therapist part, for us to have kindness. We talk about compassion and empathy, but what about kindness? Kindness and generosity. That's never talked about. I do. And want to suggest that, and encourage us to think about that. And this other thing that's not talked about so much with respect to patients is that they be able to have courage. Okay, upliftingly, Model 5 conceives of the narratives that the patient had constructed as a young child in a desperate attempt to make sense of her world, to make meaning of it, both the deprivation and neglect, what I call absence of good, and the trauma and abuse, what I call presence of bad, to which she was being continuously exposed. conceives of the narratives as able to be updated and rendered more reality-based, these narratives, which underlie the patient's psychic inertia and thwarted potential, and I do think of them as the subversive undertow, are thought not to seal her fate. We're talking more specifically Model 5 here, but if rewritten and rescripted, to hold the potential for reconfiguring her future and for advancing her from analysis paralysis to actualization of her dreams. All right, consider the case of a patient who resists venturing into new social situations for fear of being shamed. The psychoanalytically informed approaches, models 1 to 4, put simplistically, but would focus on first exploring the historical roots, or what we used to say, genetic underpinnings, of the patient's irrational fear of being shamed, and on then gradually working through, most efficiently if done within the context of the transference, the parental errors of omission, absence of good, and the parental errors of commission, presence of bad, that might have given rise to it, and to it. Generally, grieving would play a pivotal role in liberating the patient from her irrational fears, her infantile attachments, and her compulsive repetitions. But the constructivist Model 5, brain-based, constructivist, action-oriented, goal-directed, et cetera, but the constructivist, as in you construct narratives, scripts, and you rewrite them and rescript them. But the constructivist Model 5 would highlight the patient's conditioned fear of being shamed as outdated and maladaptive, and would then repeatedly and decisively challenge this procedurally organized and implicitly held relational expectation of being shamed by encouraging the patient to envision the possibility of something new, different, and compellingly better for her future. The jolting violations of expectation resulting from this repeated, startling, and decisive juxtaposition of conditioned old bad with envisioned new good would ultimately generate enough cognitive, experiential, somatic dissonance that a new, more reality-based narrative, masterminded by the wisdom of the body and its intrinsic need to maintain, or if lost, to restore homeostatic balance, could then be locked in or reconsolidated in the place of the old, now disconfirmed narrative, such that going forward, the expectation would be not of being shamed, but of being accepted. Okay, so neuroscience. Bear with me, please, here for these next several slides that speak to the phenomenal impact and significance of therapeutic memory reconsolidation. Neuroscience supports the idea that under the right circumstances and with repeated impactful juxtaposition of new good with old bad, an updated and more evolved, new, different, and compellingly better narrative will ultimately replace the outdated and less evolved same old narrative. In essence, therapeutic memory reconsolidation. Relevant most obviously for Model 5, but relevant, quite frankly, for Models 1, 2, 3, and 4 as well. And I spoke to a number of the people who founded the different short-term intensive approaches, and I said, are you okay with my sort of thinking in terms of therapeutic memory reconsolidation as being sort of an important part of what it is, of the therapeutic action? And they said, yes, Dick Schwartz and David Feinstein and Pat Ogden and others, just to make sure that I was on track here. Okay, therapeutic memory reconsolidation, juxtaposing updated new good with outdated old bad, an evolutionary necessity to keep the mind current and relevant. And here we have a little girl. It's kind of like patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time. That's what you're going to see we're doing with therapeutic memory reconsolidation. Okay, neuroscientists had long believed that once a new experience, especially a traumatic one, had been stored in long-term memory, it would be permanently installed. Perhaps it could then be modified by subsequent experiences, but its essence would nonetheless remain intact. Lurking just beneath the surface as a somatic memory, ever vulnerable to being reactivated and re-experienced, thereby reinforcing its intensity before once again returning to body consciousness. This was very much in keeping with Hebb's postulate, advanced in 1949 by the neuropsychologist Donald Hebb. Neurons that fire together wire together, meaning that reactivated and re-experienced memories are simply reinforced through repetition and never resolved. If we are therefore ever busy inviting our patients to, I learned this from my students in the course that I teach at William James College in October, and they brought it up and so like, oh my God, yes, here we go. If we are therefore ever busy inviting our patients to remember, relive, and retell their early on traumas, as we simply bear witness and resonate empathically with their lived experience of intense fear, terror, helplessness, and hopelessness, without offering them as an alternative something new, different, and compellingly better, then are we not possibly doing them a grave disservice? If that's all we do, won't we be potentially running the risk of inadvertently reinforcing those traumatic memories of abuse without actually resolving them? In other words, if all we do is to support the patient as she remembers, relives, and gives voice to her lived experience, without at the same time challenging the old bad narratives by encouraging her to envision new good antidotes as possible alternatives, old bad narratives that she had constructed in a desperate attempt to make meaning of the deprivation and neglect, absence of good. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's that important. And the trauma and abuse, presence of bad, to which she was being subjected in her family of origin, and that have now become the subversive filters through which she experiences self, others, and the world around her. If all we do is to support without at the same time challenging, then are we not potentially creating an untenable situation over the long haul of analysis paralysis and neural entrenchment through our unintended reinforcement of old bad? Admittedly, the patient might well feel wonderfully validated, but won't she thereby have become potentially ever more entrenched in those developmental relational traumas and the maladaptive, disempowering narratives to which those traumas had given rise? Another impetus for my sort of getting at the importance of Model 5, of having a Model 5, a more short-term intensive approach, is that at a conference, one of the conferences that I was discussing a psychoanalytic case that had been 32 years. And the patient, the therapist was pleased that the therapist now had all sorts of insight and awareness. And she was very proud of that. But meanwhile, the patient, who had been a practicing MD doctor 32 years later, was disabled and disabled. And yet she had whatever. So, and it became clear as the story unfolded that the therapist was empathically listening and bearing witness and helping the patient to give voice to all of her early on traumas. And the patient was getting worse and worse and worse. Now, that doesn't always happen, but that was something, that case that I was discussing on a panel is part of what, what motivated me here. Fortunately, over the course of the past several decades, a dedicated group of trailblazing cognitive neuroscientists, dissatisfied with the deterministic idea that memories, like diamonds, are forever, have been using advanced neuroimaging techniques, including functional MRIs, scanning microscopy, and optogenetics, to map out what happens in the brain when a thought is being thought, a feeling felt, and a memory remembered in an embodied, lived fashion. Their focus has been on how old memories, especially implicitly held traumatic memories consolidated in long-term memory and distributed in networks throughout the cortical limbic system. In other words, implicit relational knowing can be subsequently updated and reconsolidated. The cortical limbic system, real quick, like some of you won't care about this at all, others of you will, is responsible for integrating emotion with cognition and producing appropriate behavioral output. Real quick, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that everybody's talking about these days: executive function, working memory, cognitive flexibility, motivation, planning, abstract reasoning. The anterior cingulate cortex mediates tension between the emotional limbic system and the cognitive prefrontal cortex. As such, it plays a central role in processing emotional experiences at the conscious level and promoting goal-directed, sustained attention. And then, of course, our friend the amygdala controls autonomic responses associated with fear, anxiety, and emotional stimulation, and initiates the fight or flight response to stress. The amygdala, as we know, can hijack or shut down the prefrontal cortex when stressed. And the hippocampus, responsible for learning and for the processing and storage of short-term memory. And there's a pretty picture. Traumatic memories are stored long-term in distributed brain networks throughout the cortical limbic system. Indeed, cognitive researchers are discovering that the brain, in response to ongoing new experience and information, corrective experience information, is continuously adapting by modifying itself at the level of the neural synapse in order to stay current and relevant. This learning process, which involves both unlearning old bad and learning new good, both the destruction of old neural networks and the construction of new ones, speaks to the adaptive capacity of the brain and the dynamic nature of memory. In essence, the brain's remarkable, yes, neuroplasticity. And Norman Dodge talks about the brain that changes itself, indeed. That was back in 2007. More specifically, neuroscientists have recently made the groundbreaking discovery that when implicitly held memories are reactivated and re-experienced in an embodied, lived fashion, the network of synapses encoding those memories will become unlocked for a time-limited period. This unlocking, or deconsolidation as it's called, signals the opening up of a reconsolidation window, a brief window of opportunity when memories become transiently fragile and sensitive to modification by environmental input. This is so exciting. Both this dedicated group of cognitive neuroscientists who study memory reconsolidation in their laboratories and the similarly impassioned group spearheaded by Bruce Ecker and David Feinstein of neuroscientifically inclined clinicians who study it in their offices agree that 4 to 6 hours is the critical time frame for the destabilized synapses encoding the traumatic memories to remain malleable and therefore vulnerable to updating by new experience and information. 4 to 6 hours. Why aren't our sessions 4 to 6 hours? Well, retreats often do provide 4 to 6 hours. Most of us, our sessions are either 45 minutes, 50 minutes, 60 minutes, 75 minutes, or 90. Such that these synapses can be rewired under the right circumstances and the traumatic memories they encode reprogrammed. Interestingly, somewhat surprisingly and counterintuitively, the brain can change itself in response not only to experiencing something new, but also to imagining something new. In fact, a growing body of evidence supports the finding that simply visualizing or envisioning something, even though it occurs entirely in the mind, is sometimes almost as effective as actually doing it. According to research being done at the Cleveland Clinic, participants were able to strengthen muscles just by visualizing physical movement. This impact simply required concentrated mental practice, the cognitive rehearsal of a physical activity without actual movement. One study demonstrated that if subjects wanting to master a particular skill were simply to visualize mastery of it, then they would be able to decrease by 50% the number of actual practice hours required. Just observe Olympians. And of course, we have the Summer Olympics coming up shortly. And I'm pleased to say that Simone Biles, yesterday on TV, we saw, she just nailed it. She just nailed it. And she's not going to get the twisty. She's just going to do it. She's going to go back to the Olympics. And I think we're all rooting for her. She's going to nail it. Anyway, that was Simone Biles. Anyway, just observe Olympians doing their visualization exercises with their eyes closed as they prepare to compete in such sports as figure skating, swimming, diving, dressage, downhill skiing, gymnastics, skateboarding, and pole vaulting, to name a few. Clearly, top-ranked athletes figured out long ago that focused mental practice can definitely improve physical performance. And there's a nice little chart of what we've said. When therapeutic memory reconsolidation updates a traumatic memory, what is it that changes? And what is it that remains the same? Importantly, the fact of the event underlying the traumatic memory will not change. That is, the episodic memory, as it's called, itself will remain intact. You don't just sort of, it's gone. Rather, what will change will be the body's memory of the trauma, its emotional charge or valence, and the narratives to which the trauma had then given rise. In other words, how the patient positions herself in relation to the traumatic experience, how she contextualizes it, will change. Importantly, neuroscientists have discovered that the consolidation and reconsolidation of memories requires the synthesis of new proteins in the cortical limbic system. Aha, something very scientific here. And that inhibiting protein synthesis will interfere with long-term potentiation. That is, with the transfer of traumatic memories from short-term storage in the hippocampus to long-term storage in distributed networks in the cortical limbic system. Some promising research is now being conducted with the synthetic drug propranolol, a beta blocker that dampens the stress response peripherally. I have colleagues who take that before they speak publicly. I didn't take it. And inhibits protein synthesis centrally. Because research being done on that, because it disrupts memory consolidation and reconsolidation. Propranolol, a beta blocker, is a promising novel treatment for patients suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And here we have, although propranolol does not erase the traumatic memory itself, it can modify the negative emotional valence associated with the trauma. Pretty cool. Memory, Oscar Wilde once quipped, is the diary that we all carry about with us. After referencing Wilde's quote in his 2010 Scientific American article on the overwriting of traumatic memories, Daniel Lametti, a neuroscientist at McGill, quipped, perhaps, but if memory is like a diary, it's one filled with torn out pages and fabricated passages. Yes. Which is a poetic way of describing the quantum nature of memory. The idea that memories are created by the act of remembering. Similar also to the quantum idea that no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man. There's nothing permanent except change. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus. Okay, clinical example from trauma victim to trauma survivor. When Maria was a young girl, she had experienced frequent emotional abuse at the hands of her rageful alcoholic father. And in a desperate attempt to make sense of that abuse, she had decided, right, to make meaning of the presence of bad, she had decided that it must have been she who was the bad one, she who was at fault. But Maria was fortunate enough to be working with a therapist who understood the transformational power of therapeutic memory reconsolidation, and who therefore offered Maria a rapid-fire series of empowering and disconfirmatory experiences, albeit imaginary, that repeatedly and forcibly challenged Maria's conditioned relational expectation of being always the victim. These juxtaposition experiences took place in conjunction with reactivated, embodied memories of her father's abuse. Okay, so patting the head and rubbing your tummy at the same time. It doesn't have to be exactly at the same time, and models 1, 2, 3, 4 are probably not always exactly at the same time. In model 5, as I suggested, it's more, and as I discover it, like EMDR, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, and some of the other ones, it's more obvious juxtaposition. So the juxtaposition experiences taking place in conjunction, in this case, with reactivated embodied memories of her father's abuse, such that Maria was eventually able to update therapeutic memory reconsolidation. Her self-negating narrative. No longer did she experience herself as being ever at risk for being abused. Instead, Maria came to realize that it was her alcoholic father who had been the victimizer, and she who was innocent. Importantly, despite now having an updated narrative that offered a fresh, more reality-based perspective, Maria still remembered the fact, the episodic memory, of her father's abusive rages, but she was no longer convinced that she had deserved the abuse and that the world was a dangerous, unsafe place. In essence, she was able to reinterpret the entire scenario as a story not about herself as ever vulnerable to being abused by outside malevolent forces, but about her father as an often out-of-control alcoholic who would periodically fly into irrational and unjustified rages. Healing does not mean the damage never existed. It means the damage no longer controls our lives. So in the tradition, just finishing up with Model 5, of other problem-solving, solution-focused, goal-directed, action-based, future-oriented models, Model 5 focuses on, in a way that Models 1 to 4 don't. Although when you do go to that, then you're talking Model 5. Envisioning of possibilities, taking ownership of the need to change, setting coherent, purposeful, and embodied intention, committing to action, creating one's destiny, realizing one's dreams, actualizing one's potential, self-empowerment, personal agency, freedom, and choice. Model 5 is not deterministic. It is a constructivist model, empowering and inspiring of hope. This time, unlike models 1 to 4, where the patient leads for the most part and we follow, in Model 5, the therapist leads and the patient follows. Together, they co-create the patient's future. It takes commitment, hard work, and courage on the part of both. And I should add the word generosity, shouldn't I? Generosity as well. Abraham Lincoln, the best way to predict your future is to create it. C.S. Lewis, you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. You can't see this too well, but this is an Ann Landers quote. Nobody gets to live life backward. Look ahead. That is where the future lies. Simple but profound. Okay. Over the course of each session, how do we best position ourselves in relation, my eyes on the time, in relation to the patient in order to be optimally effective? I will be suggesting ongoing use of empathic interventions as sort of the backdrop, designed to tease out the patient's old bad, procedurally organized, implicitly held, conditioned, firmly entrenched, whatever, maladaptive defenses, and disempowering narratives. Use of these empathic interventions, to create the backdrop and thereby to set the stage for periodic introduction whenever moments of opportunity present of optimally stressful interventions, Model 1 conflict statements, Model 2 disillusionment statements, Model 3 accountability statements, Model 4 facilitation statements, Model 5 quantum disentanglement statements. Those are all growth incentivizing, optimally stressful interventions in my psychodynamic synergy paradigm. So against the backdrop of the empathic, and I'm going to explain in a moment what I mean by empathic interventions, because they're a specific something, which create the backdrop and set the stage for these optimally stressful interventions designed to provide corrective challenge of those subversive but ego-syntonic and deeply ingrained defenses, narratives, and core beliefs that the empathic statements were busy teasing out. So the empathic statements are going to be resonating in a really good, empathically attuned way, and then teasing out the patient's old bad maladaptive defenses and disempowering narratives. So you get kind of quite a bit work done with your empathic statements. So with the therapist's finger ever on the pulse of the level of the patient's anxiety and capacity to tolerate further corrective challenge. Whenever possible, the therapist will therefore alternately and repeatedly, these are the optimally stressful ones, challenge the defense by directing the patient's attention to where the therapist would want the patient to go, and then support the defense by resonating empathically with where the patient is. Now, for the last decade or so, I have always said that I have called upon Salman Akhtar's brilliant distinction, the disruptive attunement that is challenging of the defense on the one hand, and then Salman Akhtar's homeostatic attunement to name what I describe as supporting the defense. And because I love what Salman Akhtar has written about disruptive attunement, challenge, and homeostatic attunement. Both are attuned, but done in slightly different ways. Both challenge and support are attuned, but done in slightly different ways. So I was presenting this at a conference that it happens, Jim Herzog was on with me. He was seated beside me. And so I'm saying, and as Salman Akhtar highlights, and Jim raises his hand and basically says, if I could be so bold, actually, Salman Akhtar does talk about it, but it was I who talked about it first. So anyway, with apology to Jim Herzog, my friend Jim Herzog, I did not know that. And I have here James Herzog, 1984, and Salman Akhtar, 2012. Disruptive attunement on the one hand, homeostatic attunement on the other. Homeostatic attunement is aptly named because being attuned, always with compassion and never judgment, to where the patient is in the moment, will indeed temporarily support the homeostatic balance of the patient's defenses. Empathic interventions do just that. Disruptive attunement is aptly named because challenging the homeostatic balance of the patient's defenses will indeed temporarily disrupt the dysfunctional status of those defenses. And optimally stressful interventions, whereas empathic statements are homeostatically attuned, optimally stressful interventions are a story about homeostatic attunement and disruptive attunement, support and challenge of the patient's defenses. Repeatedly, judiciously, and strategically leveraging the patient's anxiety for second-order change to galvanize transformation and growth. This ad for a hair product. Wash, rinse, and repeat. Challenge, support, and repeat. That's repeat. Okay, good. Oh, well, I did want to say, yeah. So in essence, you're attempting to create optimally stressful growth incentivizing leverage points, a new term that's come my way, that are strategically designed to facilitate the therapeutic action. And Donella Meadows has come up with this beautiful term. These are places within complex, adaptive, chaotic systems where a small change in one thing can produce big changes in everything. And these are these leverage points. And we're talking about systems theory here. Complex, adaptive, self-organizing, nonlinear, dynamical, chaotic systems, which in essence, our self-regulatory defensive and adaptive mechanisms are. Co-created emergence of change. Yeah, everything's co-created. I haven't gotten into a big thing about how everything's co-created, but I do feel everything is co-created. Just saying. Leverage points are like acupuncture points, places where finely tuned strategic intervention is capable of creating lasting change, creating positive ripple effects that spread far and wide. But how do we get that balance between challenge and support just right? By being ever attuned to the impact of what you're saying on the patient and attuned to just sort of where the patient is, feeling our way into the patient's experience in the moment. Challenge support. Indeed, we all find ourselves sometimes a little confused about what to do next. Not quite sure what to do right now. Keep left, do not follow. What's a therapist to do? So Yogi Berra has an idea. Perhaps the best advice is when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Okay. All right. So now we're going to do some optimally stressful interventions that indeed both challenge by directing the patient's attention where we would want her to go, disruptive attunement, and support by resonating empathically with where the patient is, homeostatic attunement. Yeah, actually, that was that. But I'm actually going to do empathic interventions right now, I see, which primarily support homeostatic attunement. So this is important. This is backdrop. So if there's one thing to take, please, from my presentation, although I certainly hope you'll take more than just one thing, but if there's one thing, please, these empathic interventions. They provide the backdrop and where I spend the majority of my time. They tease out and bring into focus both the patient's affect and the narrative with which that affect is associated. Formulating these empathic statements requires of the therapist that, moment by moment, she be interoceptively grounded in her body, at the same time that she is empathically attuned to what Robert Mellman has called the locus of the patient's narcissism. In other words, what most matters to the patient in the moment. The therapist's listening stance at these times is probably best described as one of having an agendaless presence, in the words of Daniel Goleman, and of being a mindful witness, in the words of Tara Brach. These empathic statements reassure the patient that she's being understood and that she's not alone. Empathy is simply listening, holding space, withholding judgment, emotionally connecting, and communicating that incredibly healing message of you're not alone. Examples. It's hard to know where to begin when everything feels so overwhelming. That's an affect, close enough. It's hard to know where to begin when everything feels so overwhelming. It's uncomfortable to be here when you're not sure that therapy is really helping anyway. Look at how much you got done there to a patient who at the beginning of the session is sort of fidgeting and not quite sure where to start. It's upsetting to be feeling this out of control. All of which speak to both the patient's affect and the associated theme, that is the story or narrative that goes with the feeling. You're tired of thinking about whether you should stay or go. You have such deep despair about ever being able to find a true soulmate. You're terrified that you will be disappointed. You're terrified that you yourself will disappoint. You're confused about how best to use the session. You worry about what I might be thinking. See how much can get said there? Now, interestingly, empathic statements that highlight what the patient is experiencing in a specific context, it is painful to be feeling so misunderstood by Juanita, can then usually be generalized from the small to the all. It is painful to be feeling always so misunderstood. By the same token, empathic statements that highlight what the patient is experiencing in the present, it's painful to be feeling so misunderstood, can then usually be extended to the past. It's painful to have been feeling so misunderstood for so long now. And that's how we ease the patient into remembering and revisiting the early on unmastered traumatic relational failures that had given rise to the rigid defenses and the old bad narratives in the first place. Now, this is sort of my favorite slide. With respect to the framing of an empathic statement, please note that instead of, this is just my recommendation, but instead of, I wonder if it's painful to be feeling so misunderstood, or it sounds as if it's painful to be feeling so misunderstood, or it seems as if it's painful, or it must be painful. You could simply say, it is painful to be feeling so misunderstood. It is astounding how many people feel that they have to say, well, as they stroke their beard, oops. Sorry. Okay, as they stroke their beard, I wonder if it's painful to be feeling so misunderstood. That's so heady. You're putting extra words before just being present. It is painful to be feeling so misunderstood. And it can be followed by an implied question mark, thereby signaling that you are very open to having your statement amended. Sort of an ellipsis, ... question mark, ... So I do my best to eliminate extra words at the beginning of the statement so that I can cut right to the chase. It breaks your heart that she doesn't seem to care. Extra words run the risk of putting too much distance between you and the patient when you're trying to be empathic. And furthermore, empathic interventions should be about the patient and not about the therapist. I wonder if, and not about what the therapist is or is not wondering. Indeed, empathic interventions are designed to highlight both the affect and the narrative with which that affect is associated. And in the process, they'll be gently teasing out and bringing into focus some of the defensive and less healthy recurring themes, habitual patterns, and conditioned repetitions in the patient's life. In essence, they're making explicit the stories, the narratives that the patient as a young child had constructed in a desperate attempt to make sense of her world. But these stories, these narratives, are made up and disempowering stories that have now generalized from the small, her nuclear family, to the all, the world around her. Narratives that have now become the go-to distorted filters through which she experiences self, others, and the world. Again, these empathic statements do not specifically catalyze structural transformation and growth, second-order change, but they do lay the groundwork for optimally stressful interventions that will. And they may also bring about first-order change, behavioral change. So yeah, it's all good. Okay, final slide on this part, then we're moving forward. Parenthetically, many of these empathic statements are doing something to which Terry Real refers as joining through the truth, namely highlighting painful, difficult, and problematic truths that the patient both does and doesn't know. When you feel that you've been wronged, you can get pretty ugly if you have to. Because you believe that what your father did to you was so unfair, deep down you harbor the conviction that the world now owes you. That's an empathic statement, but he is kind of joining through the truth and sort of like, they don't love it that you said that, but yeah, okay, yeah. All right, so examples. Model 1 conflict statements, Model 2 disillusionment statements, Model 3 accountability statements, Model 4 facilitation statements, and Model 5 quantum disentanglement statements, all of which are strategically designed to generate discomforting but growth incentivizing mismatch experiences by repeatedly introducing a corrective challenge to the dysfunctional status quo. And whether that optimally stressful challenge involves, and these are the Ds, cognitive dissonance, affective disillusionment, relational detoxification, existential dependence, synaptic deconditioning, disentanglement. I'm going to read you one or two from each of these. Let's see. Model 1 conflict statement. You know that if you're ever to get on with your life, you'll have to let go of your conviction that your childhood scarred you forever. Do they know that? Yeah. They do know that. It makes them anxious. You can make them anxious. It's okay. And again, some of my supervisees and my students will say, oh, but that will make them anxious. They're like, yeah, it will. In order so that we can destabilize things, creating thereby opportunity for restabilization at a higher level. Okay, you know, and you can't cheat. It has to be something they really do know. You know that if you're ever to get on with your life, you'll have to let go of your conviction that your childhood scarred you forever. But it's hard, now you resonate empathically, homeostatic attunement, not to feel like damaged goods when you grew up in a horribly abusive household with a mean and nasty mother who kept telling you that you were a loser. I mean, you're kind of putting some interesting stuff together here. I mean, these are their words. When you grew up in a horribly abusive household, you and they have agreed, horribly abusive, mean and nasty mother kept telling them that they were a loser. You're putting it together here. But that as long as they hold on to this conviction that that scarred them for life, then indeed, that they won't be able to get on with their life. You've said a lot. Okay, well, here's one. You're coming, okay. All right, you're coming to understand that your anger can put people off. They know that, they've said that. But you tell yourself that you have a right to be as angry as you want because of how much you've had to suffer over the course of the years. See, so you're packing a little bit of punch here. Optimally stressful, growth incentivizing. Model 2, you had so hoped that I would tell you what to do, but you're beginning to realize that I don't simply give you the answers and it infuriates you. You would so, third one, you would so have wished that I could know what you were thinking without your having to say it. But you're coming to see that it doesn't always work that way, and it breaks your heart. You would so hope that we could have a personal relationship, but you're coming to realize, albeit reluctantly, that a therapy relationship is not really about friendship per se, and that enrages and devastates you. Okay, model 3. Okay. I wonder if this feeling I have in relation to you, now we're focusing in on the here and now engagement. I wonder if this feeling I have in relation to you, that no matter what I say, it won't be good enough, is like the feeling you have spoken of having had in relation to your father, for whom nothing was ever good enough. And I got to do this Christopher Bolus one. It's so beautiful. Model 3. You tell me something about yourself. I'm just, because you're focusing in on the here and now engagement. You tell me something about yourself. I'm just in the process of digesting it and storing it for further understanding of you. And then along you come, wham, and tell me that what I've digested and stored inside me did not come from you at all. The problem I find is how to live with the despair I feel occasioned by your disappearances. Okay, well, we're gonna move beyond this. The way you can start some Model 3 accountability statements. It occurs to me that by way of your behavior in here with me, you're helping me to understand something that I'd never before entirely understood. I wonder if my difficulty appreciating just how desperate you were made you feel you had to do something desperate, something dramatic in order to get my attention, to a patient who's sort of threatening or thinking suicide. And Erwin Hoffman has this beautiful idea of saying to the patient, Model 3, I want to tell you X, but I'm afraid that Y. I'm tempted to give you the advice for which you are looking. But my fear is that were I to do so, I would be robbing you of the impetus to find your own answers. So you share with them what their enactment or reenactment has elicited or induced in you, and you share that with them. Here's a good one. To a patient who says she wants the therapist's approval regarding her decision to terminate, a termination that the therapist thinks is premature. Erwin Hoffman, all the way. I'm tempted simply to offer you the approval you are seeking. It is, after all, important that you do what feels right for you. But I'm also aware of feeling within myself that the time is too soon, and that were I to support your decision to leave, I might ultimately be doing you a disservice. You see how much you get said there? You share with them your own state of internal dividedness. The rule of 3, I got to say this. For the patient who's done a provocative enactment, you get to ask 1, 2, or 3 of the following. How are you hoping that I will respond? Which speaks to their id. How are you fearing that I might respond? Which speaks to their superego. How do you imagine that I will respond? Which speaks to the executive functioning of their ego. All 3 of which demand of the patient that she make explicit her interpersonal intentions, what's really going on for her, such that she found herself doing this provocative enactment. And if you happen to think it's provocative, you get to say, in essence, how do you imagine that I will respond? How do you fear that I might respond? How are you hoping that I will respond? So you can hear from her what's really going on inside of her. It's all about, in Model 3, accountability and empowerment. Oh, dear. Okay, well, I guess for another time. It's in your notes. Great tan bitch, but it's a good one. It's a good one. It's where the patient said to the therapist, great tan bitch, on side 164. Okay, all right. Okay, Model 4 facilitation statements. A part of you yearns to be seen, known, understood, but another part of you is terrified of being found. A part of you longs to have a partner, bottom 1, with whom you could spend the rest of your life and with whom you could share what you hold most dear. But another part of you cringes at the thought of putting yourself out there. It just feels too risky to open your heart once again. Okay, and Model 5, quantum disentanglement statements. My eyes on the time. Even though I generally assume that people will be critical of me because my parents were so unrelentingly judgmental, I can envision the possibility that someday I might be able to free myself of my self-consciousness and take more ownership of my right to be here on this earth. Even though I feel so alienated from everybody because I was never made to feel that I belonged when I was a kid, I can envision the possibility of someday being able to feel less alienated. I take ownership of my need to put myself out there more, and I hereby commit to being more actively engaged in my life going forward. All right, well, we're not going to do that one, but basically, the idea is a sandpile model of chaos theory. The paradoxical impact of stress highlights that. So here we have this iterative healing cycles, the sandpile model of chaos theory, the iterative healing cycles of defensive collapse and adaptive reconstitution at ever higher levels. This is a compelling visual for the cumulative impact of optimal stress on both mind and body. So you have the grains of sand, environmental stressors, steadily being dropped on the patient, the underlying sand pile that's gradually evolving. Those grains of sand will be used to build up the sand pile. But inevitably, you don't know when, just that, there will be a grain of sand that prompts a minor avalanche of the sand pile, such that there's a minor collapse. And that's what our optimally stressful interventions do. But the ongoing grains, the stressors, the ongoing grains will then reconstitute. There'll be a little scar, a little sort of little place of not looking quite right. But the ongoing input from the outside of the stressors will mean that ultimately we reconstitute at ever higher levels. It's the means by which the sand pile will then be able to build itself back up. Each time its structural integrity reinforced, even if there are some little scars and other things on the side, each time at a more resilient level of homeostasis. The irregularities in the sand pile, much like the scars we bear, poignant reminders of the minor collapses, the injuries we have all sustained over time, but ultimately triumphantly overcome. Okay, all right. You don't just wake up and become the butterfly. Growth is a process. So the idea that the working through process is an evolutionary something. They're beautiful. Change is hard at first, messy in the middle, and gorgeous in the end. Just when the caterpillar thought the world was over, she became a butterfly. There's often quantum leaps in the treatment. That's a pretty one too. All right, to conclude, we know this, that's repeat. But so let me just tease out the fundamental thing here. We're almost done. During the early years of a child's life, when the brain is primarily in a theta brainwave state and therefore highly programmable, toxic formative experiences, developmental traumas, will become procedurally organized, as it's called, and incorporated into the child's implicit relational knowing. The Boston Change Process Study Group and Carlin Lyons Ruth talked a lot about implicit relational knowing, the procedurally organized programs and core beliefs and narratives inside of us. Okay, from which so much else will derive. And I hope you understand this next line, both bad in the short term, i.e. the growth disrupting defenses that were necessary for survival, but rigid defenses, unevolved, reflexive, knee-jerk, many of them negative, both bad in the short term, but potentially good once the person gets into treatment or is lucky enough to be engaged in good relationships and can move forward and transform traumatic stressor into optimal stressor. So these toxic formative experiences, these developmental traumas from which so much else will derive, both bad in the short term, but potential good in the long term. Traumatic stressors that at the time were simply too much for the child, lacking both internal resources and parental support to process, integrate, and adapt to, and to which the child, therefore, in order to survive, had been forced to react defensively. But as an adult in psychodynamic treatment, with now the benefit of not only more internal resources, but also the compassionate support of a good therapist who is courageous and wise enough and generous enough to provide optimal growth incentivizing challenge, those early on traumatically stressful growth impeding experiences can be evoked and then worked through, reprocessed. In other words, revisited, re-experienced, reenacted in an embodied, implicit bodily knowing fashion, grieved and recontextualized, reframed, such that those early on unmastered relational experiences, once traumatically stressful and growth impeding, and something to which the patient as a child had had no choice but to react defensively and reflexively, the subversive subconscious, all those old, bad, maladaptive, disempowering narratives, such that those early on unmastered relational experiences, once traumatically stressful and growth impeding, can become optimally stressful. That's what we're doing in the treatment. We're making traumatic stressors optimally stressful. We're offering them optimally stressful interventions against the backdrop of empathic support, homeostatic attunement, can become optimally stressful and growth promoting. Optimal stress provides impetus and opportunity for growth. So optimally stressful and growth promoting, and something to which the patient as an adult in treatment will now be able to respond adaptively and more reflectively. This is appropriately deemed post-traumatic growth. That's what psychodynamic psychotherapy, second order change, does, post-traumatic growth. In sum, psychodynamic, I'm eyes on the time, I'm pretending I don't see the time. In sum, psychodynamic psychotherapy affords the patient both impetus and opportunity, albeit belatedly, to master traumatic relational experiences that had once been overwhelming and therefore defended against, but that can now, by virtue of the synergy between the therapist's loving support and the patient's underlying resilience and innate capacity to adapt to now optimal stress, can be, well, distress, be revisited, reprocessed, grieved, and reframed, such that growth impeding defenses, once necessary for survival, can be gradually transformed and expanded into growth promoting adaptations, from psychological rigidity to psychological flexibility, and stronger at the broken places. As the Beatles sing, take a sad song and make it better. Both simple and profound is this compelling idea that psychodynamic psychotherapy has the power to reconfigure the past and thereby to transform the future as rigid defense evolves into more resilient adaptation. In essence, psychodynamic psychotherapy is a story about reshaping the past to make new futures possible. In the strange and counterintuitive world of quantum physics, this riveting idea that the present has the power to rewrite the past and thereby to change the future is referred to as retrocausation. By the same token, transformation of traumatic stressor into optimal stressor, which is at the heart of the therapeutic action in psychodynamic psychotherapy, is a powerful demonstration of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and the observer effect in action. This really helped me to understand Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Albert Einstein, who famously described the quantum entanglement of quantum physics as spooky action at a distance, also wrote about timelessness in the quantum realm. The past, present, and future are only illusions anyway. Indeed, does not psychotherapy demonstrate this very same spooky action over time as well as spooky action at a distance? But it's all good. Greg Braden, last slide. Quantum science second to last slide. Quantum science suggests the existence of many possible futures for each moment of our lives. Each future lies in a state of rest until it is awakened. I wonder if one of the defenses could be rest, R-E-S-T. Let me work on that. Each future lies in a state of rest until it is awakened, from rest to awakened. From defense to adaptation, sort of more spiritual thing. That'll have to be my seventh model. Thank you for that laugh. My God, from rest to awakened. All righty. All right, thank you. Oh my God. Oh my God. See, things are co-created. I so adore Cami and so many of you who are here that it fostered in me a little creativity there. And I thank you for that. All right, from rest until is awakened. Each future lies in a state of rest until is awakened by choices made in the present. Greg Braden. All right. Ask yourself what is really important and then have the wisdom and courage to build your life around your answer. And finally, please let me just say again, I know I'm saying it twice here, but it's entirely free. My weekly spot supervision Zoom sessions, I've been doing them since the beginning of January. I'm going to be continuing ad infinitum, and both live and recorded for later viewing on my private YouTube channel. Thursdays, 12 noon to 1:30, but it's recorded and you get the recording on Friday. Please email me at marthastarkmd@synergymed.solutions. I still have my Harvard email, but I'm trying to free myself, extricate myself from it. So more reliably, it's the synergymed.solutions Q&A. And there you have it. All right, I'm going to stop share, and I appreciate, let me get there. Oh, there it is. Okay, good. Okay, good. Thank you. I realize we're running over just a little bit. Here it is Sunday. Oh, good. Hello, Midge. Hello, Midge. Oh, good. Oh, good. Okay. So, and I get to see some of you. It's so nice. And Dr. Nina, and this VHAFTHNOL, model. No, Medlon. Anyway, Carol Sherman. Hello, Carol. And Jenny again. And Dr. Frank. And Jane Fisher, James, and Christine. Oh, Jane Fisher. There you are. Oh, good. And Carol Sherman. Yep, Jenny. Robin Hollister. There you are. And so on. All right. So bless you all. And I'm open for questions. There might be some. Oh, here, let me just see something because I see some wonderful words here. Okay, Martha said, Jenny, your willingness to bring together and share these thoughts is like, the beautiful rain here in the Pacific Northwest this morning, nourishing and growth promoting. Thank you with deep gratitude. Oh, thank you very much, Jenny and Nina and Jane Fisher. And quite frankly, let me say, speaking of water and rain, some people have suggested that the way I teach is more like a fire hose, and they would wish it were a little more like a garden hose, but or maybe even the gentle rain. But anyway, I gave you the slides, and I hope that anyway, and you can re-listen to this recording. And today, let me say, I had the pleasure of feeling that I really encapsulated in the way that I wanted to my thinking of 45 years worth. And Cami and the board and all of you gave me an opportunity to do that. And I am so grateful. I mean, you get to a certain age when you become a little bit of long of tooth, as you know, that vampire gum rejuvenation that I'm going to do, so I won't be so long of tooth. And you really want to be able to sort of put out there instead of that stagnant versus generative, right? The Erik Erikson final stage, generativity, right, versus stagnation, Marcia nodding. I want to be generating, and so on. And Anne Purcell says, resting in the plane of possibility. Oh my God. Oh my God. Thank you. Anne, can I see Anne? I hope she'll appear. Make yourself appear, Anne. We can actually almost make you appear. I can make you appear. Let me see if I can make her appear. Well, maybe you will. I hope you didn't disappear. Oh, well. Anyway, I hope I didn't scare you away. All right. Anyway, thank you. Resting in the plane of possibility. Wow. Jane, I actually feel the energy from the rest to the awakened realization you just made, Martha. Now you're going to want to know not only Model 6, which is 2020 to 2030, but now I got to do Model 7, which is 2030 to 2040. And I plan to live to be very old, I have to say. My grandparents, all 4 of them, lived into their 90s, and my parents lived to 93 and 98, respectively. And I plan to live for at least another 24 years. So just saying, thank you. I do all sorts of things for robust health and organic and lifestyle choices and minimize environmental toxic exposures, et cetera, so I can live well as best I can. Okay, Dr. Dan Siegel's Wheel of Awareness model and accompanying meditation enables resting in the plane of possibility. You know, one time, thank you for naming that, Anne. I appreciate that. So one time, so I watched Judge Judy, And listen, I know you all can just kind of leave if you want. Oh, there's Ann. Hello, Ann. Hello, Ann. So I was watching Judge Judy. My dear sweet Gunnar tells me I shouldn't let people know that I watch Judge Judy, but I do watch Judge Judy when I can. But before it, what was on was Dr. Phil. And on Dr. Phil was Dan Siegel. And Dan Siegel was talking about, this was several years ago, talking about his next book about mindfulness and intentionality and all the good awareness and all the good stuff. So I actually boldly, I saw it, I loved it. I loved Dan Siegel. I know him a little bit, not well. I know him a little bit. So I emailed him and I said, I'm giving a presentation that's entitled the neuroplasticity, something, oh dear, the synergy, the neuroplastic synergy of mindfulness and intentionality. And he wrote back immediately and did a thumbs up and he said, I love it. I love it. So that's my story about Dan Siegel. So yeah, I'm going to look at resting in the plane of possibility. Thank you. Yes, verbally, Joanne, ask a question. And but
okay, let me in. Can you hear me, Martha?
Yes, I can. Go ahead, Joanne.
Okay, so I just wanted to talk thank you so much for focusing on Model 5. And I'm an ACT trained therapist, and so I often start in a more directive posture. That's just so many times these small little behavioral activations. How about as an experiment, we try this? You're afraid to talk to people. How about you wait? Like that is where we build trust and we build intimacy. And then we move backwards towards being able to work at the intimate edge or to be able to trust for that kind of more benign regression. But sometimes it doesn't go beyond kind of those more exposure tasky, trying things that get them unstuck. It never gets beyond the superficial. Whereas for other people, that's kind of like our intro. And then we're able to go actually much deeper into the other models. And I just wondered if you had any observations about, is that a failure, not a failure, is that a missed opportunity on my part to shift? Or are there some people for whom they're just going to stay up here and they're going to get something out of it, and maybe that's not deep healing? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I do. Because I'm a psychoanalyst and I was psychoanalytically trained, that sort of kind of stuck in me. And so even though over the course of the decades, I've evolved and broadened and expand the range of applicability of what I do. And, I do all sorts of things with my patients, including once telling a patient to shut up, and I pounded my fist on my chair and then I hurt my fist and I went, oh my God. And she laughed. She said, that serves me right. But anyway, I think you can start anywhere. I mean, I believe that second order work, where there's a will, there's a way. And if we have the intention, I believe that, we may need to be doing a lot of homeostatic attunement and a lot of empathic resonating with and being with the patient where they are. But I personally am rather ambitious as a clinician. And not that all of my patients have left all cured, but all of them have, well, not all of them have left, quite frankly, fortunately, but all of them have advanced from the more rigid to the more resilient. So it's not really, for me, it's about and by way of these iterative healing cycles, from less rigid, from rigid to less rigid, more flexible, more resilient. And so is it a shortcoming if the person leaves before they've done what you personally would have thought and would have hoped they could do? Not necessarily, but it might be a missed opportunity. And I personally will do whatever I can, whatever I can to sort of encourage them to stay, some of which is done by way of, when we're working on more acute stuff, which we might be doing, I will be teasing out and kind of naming some of the underlying issues just to kind of get them said. I'll say, so on the one hand, we do know now that you're feeling much better able to deal with when your husband says those kinds of things to you. Although against the backdrop of this sort of deep sadness you have had for all these years of being in a marriage where you feel so disappointed and continuously heartbroken. But at least now you're feeling you have a better way of handling when he's done yet another barb. So I
Yeah,
kind of,
just put it out there, the observations and the, you know, that kind of in a conflict statement kind of way. And then they can either choose to move forward or say, gosh, thank you. I'm so much better now able to go to my children's school and talk to the teachers. Thank you so much.
and then interestingly, they may well come back to it at a later point. The case was presented to me just earlier this week, 3 days ago. The patient had been gone and then came back to
Yeah,
do more
thank
work,
you.
people work.
I don't want to keep people, but thank you.
No, but that's good.
helpful.
And thank you for saying the name and getting it, that you can use a conflict statement to just kind of get a little bit of psycho education in there. You do know that until you
Mhm.
ultimately release yourself from Harvard, anyway, until you ultimately release yourself from this toxic relationship with your husband, that will probably get in the way of your finding your own voice, comma. But the thought is that's work for another time. It feels a little too overwhelming in the moment to sort of begin to think about dealing with that right now.
So
And I
Dr.
guess that would apply to me, even though, Martha, you do know that ultimately you really need to just sort of let go of the umbilical cord, the Harvard thing, and just go out and be freed up to do what you really want to be doing at this stage in your life, comma. Nonetheless, Kemi, yes.
So Dr. Stark, it's 1:15, and I was wondering in the light of the recording that we're doing, and the people watching, that we might wrap up.
Oh, okay. Okay. Can I finish the second part of my conflict statement?
Okay.
Okay, good. So even though you know that at some point it'll be important for you to release yourself from the entanglement with Harvard, nonetheless, you find yourself feeling a little bit scared and frightened about actually going out and being totally on your own and letting go of that Martha Stark MD at hms.harvard.edu email. And but Model 5, envision the possibility of someday of doing it sooner rather than later. Take ownership of the fact that you need to change then how you position yourself, and commit to acting thereby. So perhaps the next time you see me, who knows, maybe I will have extricated myself. Well, anyway, I wanted to definitely tell people you watched Judge Judy. Oh, that's sweet. Thank you, Anne. Let me just do one thing here, please. You know, you can get the chat. Wait a minute. Meeting. Oh, I can't save the chat. Oh, well, I would have wanted to. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I know I've run you over. It's a Sunday. I see a lovely smile from you people. And I see, and if I can't hear you, then you can always go like this, you know, right. And that means, yeah. And that means, there you go. Thank you, Christian. Thank you all, Robin, all of you. And Anne, thank you so much. Thank you, Cami and George and Bill. And thank you, and Marcia, Roseanne.
So
I
much.
think we had, and all.
Bye-bye. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.